Chapter 179, Things That Belong to Wizards. The masked man adjusted his broom and turned slightly to face Regulus. He was waiting for him to introduce himself. Regulus met his gaze without speaking. Give his name? There was no need. Even if he admitted who he was, even if he confessed to killing an abyssal whisper agent, no sensible person would cross the channel to pick a quarrel in Britain right now. The House of Black was not to be trifled with, and the balance between Voldemort and Dumbledore was precarious. Death Eaters were growing bolder, the Order of the Phoenix was preparing, the Ministry was struggling, and the whole British wizarding world teetered. Any foreign interference, or even the slightest sign of it, could set things off. The Abyssal Whisper were listed as an international dark organization, no street gang. The House of Black knew them, Voldemort knew them, and Dumbledore knew them even better. If a group like that appeared in Britain, each of the two greats would assume the other had called them in. Neither would tolerate a third party intervening. The Abyssal Whisper weren't fools. They wouldn't come here. Still, Regulus had no reason to give his name. Seeing he wouldn't speak, the masked man wasn't offended. He continued on his own. Handsome, sir. Regulus showed no reaction. Of course he was handsome. Freya, however, turned her head to glance at him. Her look was quick, unreadable. She glanced and withdrew, turning back toward the other side. Regulus suspected, with a faint amusement, that she might be smirking inwardly. He dismissed the thought. The masked man's tone grew sincere. You aren't of House Eisenhart. Don't risk your life for what isn't yours. Leave now, and we won't stop you. Regulus remained unmoved. When he saw the masked man and his companions just as unyielding as he was, the masked man shook his head, eased his broom into a slow retreat, never taking his eyes off Regulus and Freya. Just as they began to withdraw, Regulus called out, "Mr. Masked Man." The masked man halted and looked back. "What do you seek?" Regulus asked. The question gave him pause. He thought, then answered slowly, "Truth. The truth lying in the deep sea, civilizations buried by time, knowledge swallowed by the waves, things that existed before humans." He hesitated, searching for the right word, and finally settled on things. Regulus nodded. Seeing the man was willing to speak, he pressed on. Why seek them? This time, the masked man took even longer. After a dozen seconds, he said simply, "Perhaps because they exist." It sounded like an answer, and like nothing at all. I seek it because it exists. Yet Regulus understood. It wasn't a grand philosophical response. It was the explorer's instinct. Something exists, therefore it merits being seen. A secret hides, therefore it deserves unraveling. What one might gain afterward was another matter. Regulus recognized the same hunger in himself toward magic research. He studied magic, developed spells, constructed systems. The Abyssal Whisper sought the truth of magic. He sought its essence. Different directions, same fundamental logic. The thought stirred something in him. To one day put aside obligations and chase those things that truly moved him. To travel the world, explore lost ruins, solve ancient puzzles, touch truths buried by time. That life sounded desirable. But reality weighed him down. Voldemort would not grant that time. The war would not grant that space. The duties of House Black, the infighting of pureblood families, the constant scrutiny, none of it allowed for leisurely exploration. Power came first. Only with enough power could he one day choose freely. Then he could go anywhere and do anything. Not now. For now, he had to remain rational, focused on the goal ahead. Someday, perhaps. Silence stretched between them. Regulus felt Freya hesitate. Her lips moved as if she wanted to say something, but stopped. He remembered the question she had asked days before and connected it to the coordinates the masked man had hinted at, the sea ruins, the document that marked them. He suspected that might be the final objective, the answer she had been searching for, hidden in those ruins. He turned to her. She stood as always, straight-backed and heroic, but her bearing had softened. The icy majesty she'd worn while negotiating with the masked man was gone. She seemed uncertain, lips pressed together, ready to tell everything, yet held back. Regulus didn't press. He didn't ask about the document or the ruins or what she might be hiding. He only asked calmly, "How shall we fight later?" Freya blinked. She had expected him to pry. Most would be curious now. A quiet relief crossed her face, mixed with the odd sensation of being bypassed. She met his smile and felt seen and unseen at once. With a hint of a glare, she steadied her voice. "Revenge," she said. "We go all out." Regulus merely nodded. "Good." She hesitated again, softer this time. "Regulus, you really don't want to ask me anything?" He only smiled and said nothing. Freya met his gaze and felt an unusual pressure. In ordinary conversation, she had no trouble meeting him. Her eyes were straightforward, but now his smile seemed to hold many things and nothing at all. She didn't know what he knew or what he intended. She looked away first, rolling her eyes. Regulus's smile widened a little. Freya pretended not to notice. She raised her wand and flicked it toward the cabin. The door swung open, and two old brooms rose out and hovered in front of them. Traditional wooden handles, the tails neatly trimmed, the same kind Regulus had been using these past days. She handed one to him. "Let's go," she said, tone back to business. She mounted, gripped the broom, and rose into the air toward the Black Island. Regulus watched her back, swung up on his broom, and followed. The island drew nearer, its dark silhouette sliding across the sea. Chapter 180. Let's see how you hide recognition was one thing, resonance another, but at the moment both sides were enemies. An enemy was an enemy, and an enemy had to be met with everything one had. Regulus did not have the luxury of mercy or games when facing a powerful foe. The gravest mistake in battle was to underestimate the opponent, especially when the opponent was a dark wizard society made up entirely of elites like the Abyssal Whisper. Their members would sever a shoulder the instant a disintegration curse grazed them, condense arcane energy in an instant to defend against a spike at the back of the head, and retreat calmly in the brief interval after a companion's death. Any one of those practitioners was worthy of serious regard. Regulus's attitude was simple. If he could kill them outright, he would never give them a chance to recover. The masked man had said he was waiting for them on the island, but that island was the enemy's home turf. From the outside, it looked like a small barren field of black reefs. No grass, no vegetation, a cluster of low gray buildings in the center that matched the color of the rocks. But a stronghold that looked unremarkable on the surface was often anything but. Undetectable extension charms could turn a hut into a labyrinth. Confundus charms could hide an entire building. Entrances could be buried underground. Traps could be set behind doors, and warning spells could cover every reef. Places that seemed empty often concealed the deadliest things. This was the enemy's prepared ground. Regulus would not step inside. It would be too foolish. About 50 meters from the island, he signaled Freya to stop. The two hovered on their broomsticks, adjusting their angles to steady themselves. A side breeze blew, and seawater splashing onto their robes was repelled by waterproofing charms. Freya's expression didn't change. She seemed to have expected to stop here. Regulus knew she had undergone professional combat training and had sharp tactical thinking. She clearly wouldn't take the initiative to enter the enemy's prepared stronghold either. That would mean ceding the initiative. They held each other's gaze, and Regulus said, "Get ready, I'm going to cast the disintegration curse." This open stretch of sea was an excellent testing ground. Freya nodded and drew her wand, sweeping it once in front of her. The trajectory left a faint bluish trail of light that diffused into the air. Deep blue flames kindled around her, a layer of cold fire that began to swirl as she sat on her broom. The flames reflected over her face, casting a ghostly blue sheen across her cold features. Regulus watched, and the thought that had haunted him since that night flickered into sharper confirmation: blue fire. He let it pass. This was not the time for distractions. Regulus raised his wand and spoke the incantation, Dissolvo. The disintegration curse. Centered on him, an invisible ripple radiated outward. It swept over Freya. The blue fire around her flickered, rippled like the surface of a lake in wind, contracting for a heartbeat before returning to its previous state. The ripple continued outward, skimming the sea. A few meters below the surface, a school of fish froze mid-swim. Their bodies still carried inertial motion, but their life signs vanished in an instant. Scales, skin, flesh, bone, everything that made them whole dissolved simultaneously into countless tiny, unconnected particles that mixed into the seawater and were swept away by the current. The ripple moved at the speed of sound, 50 meters in 0.15 seconds, and struck the island. Almost at the same moment, a translucent barrier rose above the cluster of buildings. The barrier rippled like water from the point of impact, spreading concentric waves. The ripples were fierce. The whole wall trembled as if taking an invisible blow, about to split. That protective spell could block physical impacts and ordinary charms, but it was not a solid shield charm. A shield charm condensed a solid barrier from arcane energy. Anything passing through had to collide with it first. This barrier's logic was more like a filter, intercepting only attack forms it could recognize. The infrasound aspect of the disintegration curse was not on its list. The ripple penetrated the barrier and continued on. Freya watched, and what she saw made her eyes widen. She watched the barrier manifest under the impact, watched it tremble and yet fail to stop the attack. She'd heard Regulus explain the two forms of the disintegration curse before, but seeing it made the truth hit harder. This method of attack was simply impossible to guard against. There were no signs. You wouldn't even know an attack was coming before you were already hit. She glanced at Regulus. He held his wand steady, expression calm, hair tousled by the sea breeze as he observed the island. On the island, the masked leader knew at once they were under attack. But he had never seen this form of the curse before. He had seen another version, the grayish-green spell the boy had used on the first night, and he'd watched that one take a companion's life. He'd even reviewed the footage. That disintegration curse was powerful but dodgeable. As long as one kept eyes on the caster, watched where his wand pointed, and made an evasive move the moment the spell was cast, experienced fighters should be able to avoid it. He'd told the others that. He did not know Regulus had combined Space Leap and Space Anchor to bypass the spell's travel process, allowing it to strike directly with no tell. He hadn't seen that part. He believed the disintegration curse was powerful, but avoidable. At that moment, the leader's previous conclusions meant nothing. This spell was undodgeable from the start. There was no wand motion, no spell light, no advanced signs. They didn't know the attack had arrived until the ripples struck their barrier. The 7 masked men reacted sharply. The leader and a fellow who had been at the first night battle instantly cast shield charms. Transparent barriers expanded before them, covering their bodies. 3 of the others did the same. The lights of shield charms lit up in turn. 2 chose to dodge instead. They mounted broomsticks and shot to the sides, trying to escape the area. But the disintegration curse was an area attack moving at the speed of sound. Those 2 men hadn't even flown 2 meters when their bodies froze. Then they began to disintegrate. From the outside in, everything that had made them a person stopped existing as a whole at once. There was no blood, no screams, no struggle. They simply ceased. In the end, 2 small puffs of ash remained, scattered by the sea breeze. The 5 survivors watched helplessly as 2 companions vanished, leaving nothing. Their shield charms still held, but now those transparent walls seemed fragile. The aftershocks continued to spread. The remaining 5 felt varying degrees of illness, nausea, dizziness, as if something inside them was coming loose. The severity correlated to how strong their shields were. Those who'd cast denser barriers felt the effects less, while those whose reactions were half a beat slow began to stagger. There was no time to recover. The leader's eyes widened behind his mask as he looked out to sea. The boy, Regulus, still held his wand, expression calm, watching the island as if observing the attack's effects. The leader's gaze moved to the woman beside him, Freya von Eisenhardt. She sat wrapped in blue flames that burned unnaturally bright in the sunlight. The color of the fire, the way it burned, the pressure it radiated even from this distance. The leader's pupils contracted. He knew what that fire signified. It was not ordinary magical flame, not a dark arts conflagration like fiendfire, and not a spell any ordinary member of their order could master. It stood for a person, a name, and a piece of history. That history had passed decades ago, but its mark had never entirely faded. House Eisenhardt, no, this woman was not just a common member of House Eisenhardt. The island, the documents, the whole conflict. Suddenly, the leader realized this was not a simple factional dispute. Someone was pulling strings from behind the scenes. He did not have time to think further. Regulus moved again. He raised his wand, but this time he did not cast the disintegration curse. 3 tiny orange-red birds burst from the tip of his wand, winging outward in quick circles before flying toward the island. They were small, no bigger than sparrows, adorned with delicate feathers and lithe movements, even a little charming. The three birds flew about 30 meters out, then suddenly expanded, split, and exploded. A burst of orange-red flame erupted from their small bodies as if something long contained had been unleashed. In an instant, the three birds transformed into enormous beasts. A massive serpent coiling and thrashing, a fiery drake spreading its wings and roaring, and a three-headed hound opening all its mouths. They lunged toward the island. 183. Chapter 181. Radio waves are also waves. The five masked men on the little island had only just recovered from the first attack when three giant flame beasts leapt toward them. The leader and one other immediately apparated, their bodies twisted and vanished. The remaining three had no time to react and were swallowed by the fire. One tried to apparate as he was being engulfed, his body already turning transparent, but when the fiendfire surged, even the space around him seemed to catch light. Half of him had disappeared, the other half remained. The remaining half instantly turned to ash. Apparition requires an intact body. Severed parts cannot be reassembled. The other two struggled futilely in the flames. A shield charm held for a second, 2 seconds, then shattered. Impedimenta did nothing. Spells that struck the fiendfire were like scraps of paper thrown into a bonfire. One of the three sank downwards, his body merging with the reef as he clung and burrowed toward the ground. The fiendfire crawled along the reef's cracks, and the man's scorched screams echoed from underground before fading. The last man was completely consumed, nothing left. The fiendfire spread over the island, devouring everything. Buildings, reefs, air, ate. The heat intensified, the colors brightened, and the shapes grew more violent. Giant serpents twisted into pillars of fire, exploded into seas of flame, and chimeras shattered into countless sparks only to reform. The whole island became a sea of fire. Regulus held his 19 aloft and felt a thread still connecting him to the fiendfire, the basic link between caster and spell. But the sensation it returned was exhausting. The fiendfire roared, expanding and devouring. Its message was simple: more, larger, stronger. The urge to consume everything poured along that connection into Regulus's mind as pure, uncontrollable violence. He kept the link. With 18 continuously outputting and his will suppressing, he tried to force the fiendfire to subside, to remain within a controllable range, to obey him. He couldn't. The flame beasts had slipped beyond his command. They rampaged, devoured each other, and split into still more. Those once delicate, cute little birds had become a synonym for destruction. Regulus held on for a few seconds, then let go. He cut the continuous output of 18 back to the bare minimum, leaving only enough connection to perceive the state of the fiendfire without trying to control it. The fire still burned, fiercely. Regulus and Freya hovered in the air, watching the island. The sun was bright, the sea blue, and the black island in the distance was completely covered in orange-red flames. The fire surged skyward, thick smoke rolling up to obscure half the sky. The heat could be felt 50 meters away. The sea breeze carried the smell of burning mixed with an indescribable scent, like the aftermath of burning 18. Freya glanced at Regulus. He rode his broom with his 19 at his side, staring at the burning island with an unreadable face. No excitement, no tension, no exhaustion. She remembered the three little birds he had released moments before, so small, so delicate, so cute, and how they had become this. She remembered the invisible spell that had reduced two masked men to ash in an instant, and how those three birds had plunged the entire island into a sea of fire. The flames still burned. She didn't know how long they would last. Regulus, however, was thinking of the two who had apparated away. The leader had fled, and the other had fled too. That was expected. With opponents at that level, you couldn't leave them all behind. But he wasn't worried. If they ran, they ran. They now knew what had happened on the island and what his 18 could do. He turned to look at Freya again. Blue flames lingered around him, reflecting the orange inferno in the distance, one place calm, the other violent. They should also know who she was by now. If they were smart, they would keep away. If not, Regulus pushed the thought aside. This wasn't his first time with fiendfire. He'd been practicing since the Easter holidays, almost 4 months. Those little fiendfire birds he'd tamed could even interact with the starry sky kite like real creatures, remaining indifferent when touched. His control had become fairly refined. But the sea of fire before him was entirely different from those three birds. The little birds had escaped his control as they flew 30 meters out. They expanded, split, and erupted into something he could not govern. The flames were hot enough to melt the reef. Black lava flowed down into the sea, sending up white steam. He looked at his hands, then back at the blaze. Creating an island from the sea, no, that he couldn't do, and ordinary wizards couldn't either. That was creation, bringing something from nothing. But annihilation, complete destruction, seemed within reach. Even so, the island before him had been burned until it sank. Everything on the ground was gone. Buildings, reefs, the few masked men who hadn't escaped, all gone. Only scorched earth and flowing black lava remained. The power was immense, but it was not under his control. It was, if anything, out of control. Regulus watched the fiend fire, his thoughts tangled. From the day he started practicing the curse, he knew it was dangerous. Orion had warned him. The notes in the family library had warned him. He remembered Crabbe's fate in the original story. He had thought he had it under control, practiced within a safe range, able to use it in a controllable state. But faced with living enemies and allowed to consume everything, it still slipped free. The second form of the disintegration curse had proven itself powerful. This time it had been thoroughly verified, meeting or even exceeding expectations. But there was a problem. The leader and the other masked man had reacted incredibly fast. From the release of the second form of the disintegration curse to them casting their shield charms took no more than 0.2 seconds. At such close range, that was enough. The speed of sound is fast. 50 meters is about 0.15 seconds. For opponents at their level, 0.15 seconds is enough to do many things. Regulus thought, if sound waves could be dodged, what about electromagnetic waves? Electromagnetic waves travel at 300,000 kilometers per second, nearly 900,000 times faster than sound. At 50 meters, that's less than 1/2 millionth of a second. No wizard could react in that time. Britain has its own wizarding wireless radio network, broadcasting from Hogsmeade from morning till night. Wizards have listened since childhood and are used to it. Regulus wasn't sure if that system relied on radio waves or pure Quartz 18, but for every magical radio in the country to receive signals simultaneously, it must have the propagation properties of radio waves. Could he modify the disintegration curse? Sound waves are waves, and electromagnetic waves are waves too. If he changed the curse's propagation medium from sound to electromagnetic waves, then the spell would be truly impossible to dodge. He fell into deep thought. Freya, beside him, noticed his gaze wandering, looking at the flames and yet at nothing at all. She had been lost in thought too. She'd obeyed and held up a fire shield while Regulus completed the remaining attacks. The result had far exceeded expectations. Even away from the opponent's turf, even on the sea, it shouldn't have been so easy. Abyssal Whisper specialized in maritime combat. Movement and spell power increased on the sea. They were true naval experts. But from start to finish, those 7 masked men hadn't had a chance. The first disintegration curse turned 2 to ash. The second, 3 died and 2 fled. The 2 who escaped did so only because they reacted fast enough to apparat immediately. She had to admit, this boy, relying on his own disintegration curse, deserved to be called powerful. She glanced at the still-burning fiend fire and remembered the scene from yesterday, an orange-red little bird perched on his shoulder, staring at a silver-white Patronus. The Patronus reached out a wing to touch it and drew back as if burned, while the bird remained motionless. A person who could tame fiend fire to that degree would surely be able to control it fully in time. She had no doubt. Freya steered her broom slightly closer to Regulus. He was still distracted and didn't notice. She nudged the tail of her broom and lightly bumped him. Regulus's broom wobbled. He snapped back to reality, steadied himself, and looked at her. Freya's expression had shifted. She frowned, lips pursed, looking a little displeased. "You did my job," she said. Regulus regarded her without expression. He felt she was picking a fight. She had been the one to say, "Revenge, go all out," and now that he had done the work, she complained? Freya felt uneasy under his gaze and quietly shifted her broom to the side as if to avoid it. Regulus watched the small movement, the corner of his mouth twitching. He had long noticed that when this witch was justified and confident, her gaze was direct. She looked when she wanted to look and spoke when she wanted to speak. But when she felt guilty or uncomfortable, she would always look away. "How long will it burn?" Freya asked in her usual flat tone. Regulus watched her for a moment longer, then turned his gaze back to the island. The fiend fire still flared, but its rage had faded. "Soon," he said. "Fiend fire will die out once it has consumed everything combustible. There are only a few buildings and some reefs on that island. It won't last long." Freya nodded and said nothing more. The two of them hovered, watching the distant inferno weaken. 10 minutes passed before the flames vanished. There was no slow dying away, just a sudden absence, as if the fire had been swallowed by the air. All that remained was a blackened island, the ground lowered by several meters, a sunken pit at the center, and edges of black volcanic glass where molten reefs had resolidified. Regulus studied the ruins. From the moment the fiend fire split free of his will to the instant it was gone, he'd felt something. A blurry but real perception of how the flames expanded, how they fractured, how they broke his control. The sensation had been brief, but unmistakable. If he tried it again now, he might still lose control. But he could do better. At least he could delay the loss of control. He broke his stare. "Let's go." They flew back to the ship. As it turned and set its course home, Regulus stood at the bow and watched the island shrink to a black speck and disappear below the horizon. He hadn't expected the other side to choose such a small island as the battleground. No sane commander would land on a place that size without expecting traps. A few trigger charms and explosive wards could have made it a death trap. Whatever stronghold lay there, buildings, supplies, documents, those masked men who hadn't escaped had been reduced to ash. Even the naval combat he had hoped for never materialized. With 2 spells, the entire encounter had been decided before it began. Regulus and Freya remained at the bow in silence, neither pushing a conversation. They watched the sea and sky and the gray-blue dolphins that cavorted alongside the hull, leaping and diving and leaving foamy wakes. It was a pleasant scene. Halfway back, the ship stopped. Regulus knew Freya had the helm. He wondered if the pause signaled a confrontation. They had been led through a series of reveals. The blue flames shone without concealment, the proof of his power with the second form of the disintegration curse, the catastrophic loss of control accompanying the fiend fire. From resisting mental erosion to the changes in Regil, and now this, everything that needed exposing had been revealed. Regulus had spent days speculating about Freya's role, guide, tester, or a mission giver like an NPC. He had watched without grilling her, curious to see how she would act and what the buildup would culminate in. Through their time together, he had begun to sense that Freya was more than a tool. She had her own judgments and small private gestures, rolling her eyes, bumping people with her broom, looking away when awkwardly observed. She'd asked him twice whether there was anything he wanted to ask, and she'd shown him the blue flames from the start, if only briefly. When she spoke of that person, her tone carried complicated feelings. Maybe she couldn't take the initiative to tell him everything. Maybe certain progress had to be earned, like a quest bar unlocking stages. Now, after the second display of his power, the progress should be full. Regulus looked at Freya with a searching intensity, as if trying to read through her to the person who had arranged this. He recalled what he'd learned. Outwardly, she was a capable, taciturn combat elite, but she also had a livelier, softer side that didn't match her cold face. She had taken a mission from that person to bring him here, yet she had made small choices of her own. Perhaps she didn't mean to subvert the plan, only to leave traces of herself in how she carried it out. That bit of quiet rebellion made her feel more human to him. Then again, maybe that too was part of someone's design. If the architect knew him, they'd know he would respond better to someone who felt real. Regulus set the theorizing aside. Whatever games were at play, he felt Freya was about to disclose something. She made no preface. From her bosom, she took a silver locket engraved with delicate runes. With a light tap of her wand and a few whispered syllables, the locket popped open and she drew out a scroll. The parchment unfurled and expanded until it was roughly the length and thickness of an arm, yellowed, frayed at the edges, tied with a thin cord that swung in the sea breeze. This must be the map, he thought. It looked ordinary enough. Nothing like the ornate relic key he'd imagined. Just an old scroll that might have sat forgotten in a warehouse for decades. Freya met his gaze with a serious look, but when she spoke, her voice wavered, as if she were deciding whether to go through with it. "Regulus," she said, "you know everything now, don't you?" He lowered his eyes to the document, then looked up at her and smiled without words, a small, knowing smile that said he understood more than she realized. Freya's features softened. She seemed older and younger at the same time, as if their short time together carried the weight of familiarity. In truth, she'd known of him far longer than they'd been companions. That person had told her years ago that someone like him would appear when he would come and how he would behave. She didn't hesitate further. "This document has been in the House of Eisenhart for 30 years, she said. "Before that person, before his defeat, he gave it to my father for safekeeping. He only handed it to me this year." 30 years. The number stirred something in Regulus. He had assumed he'd been noticed only after his birth, but this suggested a timeline stretching further back, long before he existed. That made sense. His arrival didn't mean the world had been frozen until him. The world had been moving, evolving, seeing and preparing long before his arrival. He was not an outside variable rewriting the rules, only someone the world had expected. Regulus considered the implications. The House of Eisenhart had publicly resisted Grindelwald in his prime, but perhaps that was mere facade. Why else would such a document have been entrusted to them? Why hand a mission concerning him to someone connected to Eisenhart? Why did Freya know Protego Diabolica? The questions swirled, but he smothered them. They were speculative and offered no immediate answers. He took the scroll but didn't open it at once. Instead, he looked at Freya and asked quietly, "Have you seen it?" She looked almost pouty. Of course, she had wanted to read it, but she was not permitted. She only shook her head. "Do you want to see it?" he asked. Her expression betrayed temptation, but she remained silent, eyes fixed on his hands. Amused, Regulus stepped closer until they stood less than half a meter apart. He could smell a cool, crisp scent on her. Between them, he unfurled the parchment. Inside was a map, crude, almost rudimentary. A few curved lines suggested coastline. Several dots marked islands. A region was circled in dotted lines, and a few blurred letters were scrawled nearby. It was barely recognizable, but it matched the Baltic Sea region. Chapter 183, Oppression from the Deep Sea. The moment the scroll unfurled, a precise set of coordinates rose up inside both Regulus and Freya's minds. It didn't come through ordinary study or any ritual. It bloomed there as if it had always been waiting to be activated. There was no geographical description, no map marking seas or islands, only a certainty. They simply knew where to go and what to look for. The sensation was eerily familiar, like the Fidelius charm or the secrecy of 12 Grimmauld Place. Only those permitted to know could know, and once known it was carved into the mind. Regulus and Freya looked at one another. Regulus understood instantly what that point might hold. The location of that 22, the thing that made everything he had learned seem childish, the answer to Freya's question, the last chance to light up Wriggle. He raised an eyebrow. Freya nodded. They set the ship's course. Freya gestured for Regulus to come into the cabin. He pushed the door open to a small wooden room, light slanting through portholes, a fixed table with several chairs. Food had been laid out as if for a planned journey: grilled fish, bread, cheese, fruit, and a jug of pumpkin juice. Regulus glanced once and said nothing. This had clearly been prepared in advance. He sat, picked up a piece of bread, and ate. Freya sat opposite, taking her knife and fork. They sailed on. Regulus didn't time the voyage precisely. He only had the occasional sense of heading steadily toward those coordinates. When they returned to the deck, the world had changed. Nothing but sea surrounded them. No islands, no vessels, no signs of human life. The sky was a flat gray. Clouds hung low and merged with the water at the horizon, obliterating any boundary. The ship stopped and seemed to be the only thing between heaven and ocean. Though the vessel was large, here it felt small and exposed, a lone presence in a vast, indifferent emptiness. Regulus stood on the bow and looked down. The water was black, so deep that the darkness seemed to rise from the abyss itself. Staring into it gave the sensation of being watched from below. The coordinates in his head led here, but there was nothing visible, no stair, no gate, no cavern. He concentrated, and the confirmation came again. This was the sleeping sea abyss. The name appeared in his mind with the same abrupt certainty as the coordinates. They leaned over the rail together. Only blackness stared back. Regulus cast a flying charm and rose to circle the ship. Freya mounted her broom and followed. They flew some distance, several hundred meters, and returned. Nothing. No magical traces, no openings, no wards, no anomalies. The sea and the air were ordinary, but there was simply no entrance. Back at the bow, Regulus repeated the name under his breath. Sleeping sea abyss. Sea abyss. It had to be beneath the waves. The thought settled and information followed. Yes, under the sea. He looked at Freya. She had reached the same conclusion. Their eyes met. Regulus's look asked, "Go down?" Freya nodded. "Go down." There was no need for more words. They were already here, but they prepared thoroughly. Bubblehead charm first. Transparent domes inflated around their heads, allowing them to breathe and keeping seawater out. Over the outer layer, they cast shield charms, translucent barriers to resist impact and push back water. They added a warming charm to keep their core temperatures from sinking, and finally a pressure balancing charm to equalize internal and external pressure and protect internal organs. Regulus cycled through every spell he could think of. Wizards had developed mature diving methods, and these charms were standard. Prepared, they exchanged a nod and leapt into the water. For the first 10 meters, light filtered through, making plankton glitter like scattered stars. Silverfish inspected them and swam away. At 15 meters, the light thinned. At 20 meters, Regulus felt something snap against his body. The bubblehead charm burst. He inhaled reflexively, then realized that although the bubble had shattered, the shield charm still held and seawater didn't rush in. Moments later, the shield charm cracked too, shattered like glass, and dissolved into the water. The warming and pressure balancing charms went next. One by one, the spells that aided diving failed. Regulus's shield had been stronger than an ordinary 21's, but it didn't even hold for a second longer. Freya's spells failed the same way. All that remained was their basic clothing. Regulus didn't panic. He raised his 23 and attempted transfiguration, changed seawater into air. The wand tip flickered. The transfiguration took hold, but no air formed. The water remained water. The effect was suppressed or distorted. He tried other spells. Lumos lit. The levitation charm worked. Apparition was still possible. The spatial structure remained intact. Freya experimented too. Her figure blinked to Regulus's right, then to his left. The vacated space filled instantly with rushing seawater. Regulus gave her a half glare. This was hardly the time for such theatrics. Freya pretended not to notice. Then they realized something else at almost the same instant. There was no sensation of suffocation. At 20 meters, an ordinary person would soon be gasping, but they felt no oxygen deprivation. They weren't moving their lungs much. Indeed, they were deliberately holding their breath. But the feeling of airlessness never came. It was as if oxygen were being provided internally, as if their skin could absorb something from the sea or their bodies had an independent respiratory mechanism. Regulus focused, and it was true. Blood circulated, oxygen exchange continued, but not through mouth or nose. Freya had noticed it too. They exchanged a look and pushed deeper. Spells unrelated to diving continued to function. Regulus summoned a Patronus. A silver-white light burst from his chest, and the starry sky kite unfurled in the water, its glow illuminating a few meters and nudging the seawater curiously. Apparition remained available whenever needed. Only those spells explicitly meant to assist diving or general defensive charms like the shield charm were being neutralized. Regulus did not linger over why. It wasn't the time for theorizing. They descended. At 30 meters, all daylight vanished. Only a faint patch of gray clung far above. At 40 meters, the water turned bone-chilling. At 50, 60 meters, the pressure pressed in. Regulus felt his body tightened, his eardrums sting, joints stiffen. He channeled 22 to simulate internal counterpressure and felt some relief. Then, as if passing through an invisible membrane, the physical sensation of pressure abruptly shifted. The squeeze of weight dissolved and was replaced by something else, an oppressive presence that wasn't physical. Absolute darkness, absolute silence. The pressure became mental, an intangible, traceless weight on the mind and soul. Cold and vast, it distorted time and space. Regulus could not tell how long had passed or where he was. It was like being cast into the void of the universe alone. His mental defenses kicked in. Star orbit meditation ran full strength. Orion's 4.5 stars flared in his inner world, their steady, cold light probing every corner. The occlumency maze expanded layer upon layer, holding the external pressure at bay. The burden lessened enough for him to look at Freya. She, too, had felt it. Her brow was drawn, her lips set, but her gaze remained composed, not panicked. In the murk, Regulus saw a blue light flash in her eyes, faint but unmistakable, like two distant beacons. They nodded and continued downward. Regulus realized, briefly, that Freya must have been as surprised as he had been when their diving charms failed. Yet her preparations for unknown contingencies were thorough. He thought of what had taught her such readiness, but he let the thought go and focused on the descent. The mental oppression intensified. Regulus adjusted the density of his mental shields, raised the levels of his occlumency, and tuned his perception. His mind was resilient and adaptable. He learned the contours of the pressure quickly, but its growth outpaced his speed of adaptation. What began as merely taxing became straining, then finally beyond what an ordinary 21 could endure. Still, both he and Freya held on. It was clearly a barrier meant to stop the unqualified. Time blurred. Regulus only knew they were going down and down, the pressure swelling until coping demanded every scrap of his concentration. The lights of his star orbits burned brighter in his inner world, while the outer darkness thickened. Then, after an amount of time he could not measure, the pressure vanished. Chapter 184. You're right, but I don't agree. It felt like passing through a membrane. Regulus's body lightened, his feet found no purchase, and then gravity returned. He and Freya tumbled out of seawater and fell. Regulus immediately cast the flying charm to steady them and reached out to scoop Freya by the waist, tucking her under his arm. Freya went rigid. She struggled a little, then froze, hanging there as if she didn't know how to react. Regulus barely noticed. He was busy taking in their surroundings. They stood in a space beneath the seabed, sealed off by 10. The dome overhead rose impossibly high. Above, pitch-black voids swallowed everything. Around them, a soft, diffuse light glowed with no visible source, steady and even. Below stretched a flat, rocky plain, dark gray and textured like natural stone, extending until it vanished into the gloom. Regulus descended, landed, and released Freya once he was steady. She stepped aside, smoothing her clothes and hair, her expression a little awkward. Her gaze drifted uncertainly before settling on the darkness in the distance. The place was quiet, so quiet he could not even hear his own breathing. When he cleared his throat, the sound emerged but was immediately absorbed by the space and could not carry. He stamped his foot hard. There was the tactile thud, but no sound. Freya stared back, and they shared the same realization. This place swallowed sound. Regulus probed more carefully and concluded it wasn't merely a magical silence. The physical laws here seemed different from the outside. As they walked, faint lines appeared on the otherwise uniform stone beneath their feet. At first, they looked like natural fissures, but they were too regular. The lines grew denser the farther they went, and then they began to glow. The faint light thickened as the lines became patterns, then veins, like the blood vessels of a living thing. Regulus crouched and touched one of the glowing patterns. The moment his fingertip met the rock, the pattern flared, much brighter, and the light raced forward along the veins toward the distance. He withdrew his hand, and the flare subsided. Freya did the same, and the same reaction followed. They exchanged a look and kept going. The glowing web wove under their feet, stretching toward the darkness at the edge of sight. The surrounding rock shifted from flatness into folds and curves, as if kneaded by some massive force. Every fold pointed toward the same place, the source of the summons in the distance. That had to be the core. They walked on and on. In this soundless space, time blurred. Regulus could only keep track by counting steps, but he kept losing count. Then the veins of light converged and stopped. About a dozen meters ahead, all the lines gathered into a huge circular area. The patterns at its edge wound inward like dense capillaries, disappearing at the center. There was something there that defied description. It was not an object, nor light, nor anything that could be neatly defined. It existed and yet seemed not to, constantly shifting, like a reflection ruffled on water, like air shimmering above a flame, like a light seen through thick fog. Every movement suggested a different scene. Sometimes it showed endless deep sea, dark, cold, bottomless. Sometimes it showed distant stars, brilliant, cold, unreachable. At times the two merged, as if stars might hang at the bottom of the ocean. Regulus felt it directly. This perception was neither magic perception nor spatial awareness, not sight, smell, or hearing. It was another kind of knowing, lodged inside his consciousness. There, the way knowing he was alive or breathing is immediate. It simply was. Standing before it, he felt his mind begin to drift toward it, as if two adjacent bodies of water were running together. He wanted to resist, but didn't know what to resist. The thing did not attack. It just existed. His consciousness, once aware of it, instinctively wanted to understand. To understand is to approach. To approach is to make contact. To make contact is to be affected. Regulus inhaled and anchored himself with star orbit meditation. In his mental world, the 4.5 stars of Orion flared steady and bright. He planted his consciousness on those stars to stop it sliding closer. He glanced back at Freya. She stood a little behind, unmoving. When he looked at her, she shook her head gently. She didn't know what the thing was. She had come to accompany Regulus and fulfill that person's arrangement, not to explore unknown mechanisms. She wouldn't make contact, at least not now. Two people together meant one could stay clear-headed. Regulus nodded and forced his gaze back to the shifting center. It continued its alternation between ocean and stars. He waited, seeing what it would do. Then something inside his own mind was triggered. It bypassed his mental defenses and touched the 10 he had mastered, the disintegration curse. The spell he had spent 10 days and 20 exhausted mandrakes developing was pulled out of his consciousness, laid before him as if someone had taken it by hand and shown it to him. Information followed. Disintegration curse. The voice had no source, as if the thought had formed by itself, but the content was alien. You perceived the tendency toward decomposition from the mandrake and recreated it in your own way. You observe, understand, transform, create. This path is correct. Regulus felt a small stirring of satisfaction. Was this recognition? But another sentence came immediately. Have you ever considered what the essence of the decomposition tendency you captured truly is? The disintegration curse unfurled in his mind like a blueprint, the structure, the principles, the mechanics. You make it act upon matter, breaking down structures into dust. You believe your will and your 10 accomplish this. But the truth is, you have only learned to execute rules the world already possesses. The voice's explanation became more fundamental. Entropies increase, the movement from order to disorder. Things return to chaos. That is not your creation, nor is it the creation of 10. It is a rule of the world itself. The mandrake happened to carry a corner of it, and you learned to borrow that corner. The reason your disintegration curse is powerful is not your talent or toil. You have touched a foundational rule. You are its executor, not its master. Regulus said nothing. He absorbed the rest. If you accept this, you can go further. The disintegration curse need not be a spell. It can be a channel between you and that rule. You need no incantation, no gestures. You only need to allow that rule to pass through you and act upon the target. That is true disintegration. It does not need your 10. The world will do what it was already going to do. The information continued, blunt and demanding. But the price is this. You must accept that you are not the creator. Your pride, your sense of achievement, your proof of talent, these are illusions. Regulus's mental world trembled. The argument made sense, but he had no intention of accepting it. It wasn't about pride. His path was different. He was an observer, an understander, a transformer, a creator. He refused to be merely an executor, even of the world's rules. While he wrestled with that thought, another 10 triggered inside his consciousness, the Patronus charm. The image of the starry sky kite formed in front of him, silver-white wings, starry eyes, an air of freedom and curious light. The name came with it, the Patronus charm. That pulse of information echoed again. the purest condensation of positive emotion, happiness, hope, a love of life. It is the softest, brightest part of your inner self. It sounded like praise, then the tone shifted. But when you summon it, have you ever considered that you are handing your emotions over to a phantom beast? The starry sky kite in his mind seemed to be examined feather by feather, wisp by wisp of starlight. It is beautiful, and it reflects an aspect of your heart, but a reflection is only a reflection, not the original. When danger comes, you call it forth and let it stand in the way. You give the responsibility to protect to another, condensed from your feelings. That is weakness. The statement was flat, almost clinical. True protection should not be left to a Patronus. You should become the Patronus yourself. Entrusting hope to a phantom is weakness. Becoming an incorruptible absolute darkness or absolute light, that is true protection. The starry sky kite swayed as if in a sudden gust. Can you do it? Give up summoning it and become it yourself? Regulus did not answer. The information was offering another path, but it was not his. His Patronus was an externalization of his emotions. That was its strength. It could go where he could not, do what he could not, endure what he could not. To become it sounded like giving up those abilities, either surrendering the places he could not go and the things he could not do, or reducing himself to nothing but a protector. He had no interest in either. Besides, absolute darkness or light, that was a question he had turned over before. After the astronomy tower incident and his talk with Dumbledore, he had concluded that gentle means to achieve extreme ends was what he wanted. If he could choose, he wanted absolute power. Whether it meant darkness or light could be decided later. That conviction steadied him. Before he could dwell on that any longer, the Core's tendrils of information latched onto another domain, space magic. Space leap, the idea named itself. Calm and detached, the voice spoke again. You watched house elves vanish and reappear out of thin air and deduced space folding. You imitated it and developed a human version. The word humans, used deliberately, pricked at Regulus. The voice did not say wizards, it said humans. But have you wondered? House elves can do this because the essence of their magical nature is different from humans. It is not an ability learned, it is a talent written in their bloodline. What you imitate is only the surface, not the essence. The information began to dissect his spell. You use magical essence to force space to fold, pressing 2 points together. It works, but it is inefficient. Each leap fights the elasticity of space. It wants to return to its original shape, and you hold it down. That's why there must be cooldowns. You cannot use it continuously. You are imitating a bloodline talent, a shortcut, not inventing the path. You have learned the technique without understanding why it works. It brushed his space anchor charm as well. That inheritance is from your family. Your ancestors labored to crystallize it and pass it down. You inherited it and combined it with your space leap to make spell-based teleportation. But ask yourself, stripped of the name Black, if no one had left you this inheritance, could you have reached this step on your own? Regulus remained silent. You have assembled 2 borrowed things into a new application. That is a kind of creation, but still a combination, not a true fusion. The Core pushed further, guiding him toward another view. True space magic is not brute force folding, nor is it anchoring and forcing. True space magic convinces space to change willingly for you. You need not hold it down, you must invite it. Space will fold itself, unfold itself, and make way. Just as when you face fiendfire, you should not brute force suppress it, you should make it willing to be tamed. The idea unsettled Regulus. But you cannot do it yet. You are walking the path of control, not of coexistence. Your relationship with space is one of dominance and submission, not cooperation and resonance. You may continue this path. It is effective and gives you advantage in battle. There was a pause, then a deeper note. But it has an upper limit. You will not reach the heights of those who truly understand space's essence. And the Core hesitated before finishing, small and almost reluctant. They do not need magical essence. The statement ended there, abruptly. Regulus turned the word over in his mind. They? Wizards? Some other ancient existences? The blurred mass in front of him felt ancient, and the concepts it presented contradicted the mainstream understanding of magic. It suggested a more fundamental perspective, as if there were other avenues for magical essence and that those paths had been walked. Grindelwald had been the one to arrange his coming here. Had Grindelwald been given this information too? Had he seen this? Chosen differently? The thought was fleeting. There was no time to chase it. Another thread of knowledge brushed his core: star orbit meditation. In his mind, Orion's constellation lit up. The 4.5 stars of Orion's, the foundation he had built step by step. You temper body, spirit, and magical essence with the orbital paths of stars, the voice said. You visualize Orion and let its light illuminate your inner world. You believe that by following this path, the starry sky will one day unfold within your mind. This is your creation, your path, your most cherished thing. Then, unexpectedly, the voice asked, "But have you ever thought what you are imitating?" Orion's map spread out in his head. Alnitak, Alnilam, Mintaka, Betelgeuse, Rigel, stars marked by position, brightness, trajectory. You imitate stars. You let them shine on you, guide you, temper you. You make yourself something that must be lit by them. But true power is not to be illuminated. You should become the light source yourself. There is no need to imitate stars. Become a star. No, go further. Become the abyss that swallows light. Under the core's gaze, Orion's light seemed to dim. Stars burn out. The abyss does not. A star must exist to shine, but the abyss need only not exist to consume existence. If you continue star orbit meditation, at best you become a bright star. Above the stars there is the abyss. Do you want to look? Regulus felt his mental world tremble. The idea described a completely different way of being, non-existence that devours light. He would not need to be illuminated. He could be the endpoint of every light. He could not fully grasp it, but he saw it, the abyss that the mass represented. It was not merely darkness, because darkness is the absence of light. This was an absence that made light meaningless. If he followed that path, star orbit meditation would be surpassed, overwritten. A star would have no meaning before the abyss. He steadied himself. This was another path, not his. His path was to become a bright star, to make himself shine, to use light to cut a way forward. The alternative was to become the abyss and render all light meaningless. Two utterly different directions. He could examine it, but he need not walk it. At that moment, Rigel, the star he had never quite managed to fully ignite, flickered slightly in his inner map. Not a light, merely a response, as if acknowledging his awareness of the alternate path while accepting his choice to remain on his own. It felt like protection, guarding the path he meant to walk against external disruption. Regulus settled. He withdrew his focus and regarded the vision once more. It was still there, shifting between deep sea and stars, but now he no longer passively received its deconstruction. He began to analyze it. Was the disintegration curse the execution of world logic or his own invention? Was the Patronus charm weakness or wisdom? Was space magic mere combination or a potential fusion? Was star orbit meditation imitation of stars or becoming the abyss? He would need time to think. For now, at least, he knew he would not be shaken. Deep inside Regulus's consciousness, the entity continued its work. After the disintegration curse had been reconstructed, after the Patronus had been examined, after space magic had been negated, and after star orbit meditation had been compared, it fell quiet for a moment. Regulus knew, however, that it was not finished. It had only shown the existence of another path, not forced him to take it. Now it waited for him to answer. He stood in his mental world and watched the lights of Orion's 4.5 stars. Betelgeuse was the brightest, followed by Alnitak and the rest. Rigel flickered faintly, as if it too were waiting for him to figure something out. Regulus reviewed what the entity had reconstructed. Each demonstration had pointed to a more efficient route, but none had claimed absolute correctness, only the existence of another way. He thought it over. To execute the rules of the world sounded like it might be truer to the underlying nature of things than inventing rules himself. But if he merely executed the rules, where would I be? The disintegration curse had become his because of the process, sensing, understanding, transforming, creating from the mandrake. That had been his path, his choice, his mark. If he simply executed rules, the spell would belong to the world, not to him. He could accept the world's things becoming his, but he could not accept his things becoming the world's. The Patronus was the beginning of his sensibility. the fusion with his reason, the direction of his chosen path, an idea he had decided to see through. He could not give that up. Becoming a Patronus might be powerful, but for him it was not an option. And space magic? He asked himself inwardly what was wrong with imitation. All magic had started with imitation. Ancient wizards mimicked natural phenomena to make fire spells, lightning spells, and water spells. Modern wizards had inherited those foundations and built the current system by constant reference. Imitation was a beginning, not an end. He had imitated a house elf, but he had not stopped there. He turned that principle into a spell wizards could use, allowing them to do what only a house elf once could. That was transformation. What was wrong with inheritance? The centuries accumulated by the House of Black were meant to let him stand on their shoulders and see further. He used the space anchor charm, but he also developed space leap, combining inheritance with his own inventions to achieve what his predecessors had not. That was transcendence. And what was wrong with combination? The entity had called space leap merely a combination, not a fusion. Perhaps that was true for now. But if something could be assembled and used, it could be improved. And if it could be improved, it could be fused. He had only just set foot on that long path. He remembered Professor McGonagall's spatial transfiguration, stretching, flipping, twisting spatial structure without incantations, with only a light tap of the wand. Had she already internalized the spells so they no longer needed words? He did not know, but he knew he could walk that path too. Perhaps one day, when he had gone further and turned combination into fusion, when space became less an object to be manipulated and more a partner that coexisted with him, his space magic would have its own distinct form. Star Orbit Meditation's suggestion that it is better to become an abyss than to imitate the stars made the most sense and was the most dangerous. Stars would die, an abyss would not. The abyss only had to cease to exist, and everything else would be swallowed. But Regulus looked at the cold, steady lights and their slow arcs. Those stars might die, but in billions of years. He was 12. What was the rush? He opened his mental eyes. The lights of Orion's 4.5 stars were brighter than before. Wriggle still flickered, but its rhythm was changing, as if asking, "Have you figured it out?" Regulus did not answer directly. He focused instead on the entity. It was still there, constantly shifting, but this time he could sense its essence more clearly. It was only showing a different road, saying it was available for him to take or even be led along, but not compelling him to choose it. Whether he chose it was his own business. He nodded to himself. He had figured it out. He did not have to follow that path, but he would thank it for showing him the way. In his head he said, "You are right, my path is inefficient and it has a ceiling. So what? I am 12. I have 100 years, maybe several hundred, to walk it. A ceiling is meant to be broken, not accepted." The entity did not answer. It simply continued to change. Regulus added softly in his mind, "How do you know my path won't one day surpass yours?" He made his final reply inwardly. "The reason my magic is precisely because it contains my rationality, my insights, and my choices, even my mistakes and inefficiencies. Strip those away, and however strong the power is, what does it have to do with me?" When that sentence echoed through his inner world, the lights of Orion's 4.5 stars suddenly flared. It felt like confirmation, confirming who he was, what he wanted, and what could not be shaken. Regil brightened completely. The blue-white light filled the mental space, soft and steady, not blinding. It simply burned with a calm steadiness. Regulus felt a single word rise in his chest: protection. It did not mean protecting external objects or other people. It meant protecting the boundary of me being me, the independent will named Regulus. He felt something like emotion. "Wriggle, you have finally lit up." From the first time he had sensed its presence in the star orbits to the many attempts that had failed to light it, until this moment deep on the seabed of cognition, within the tide this entity stirred, it had finally come alight. For the first time, the 5 stars of Orion felt complete. Betelgeuse flared in the distance, the belt linked at the center, and they performed their duties and echoed one another. Betelgeuse's eruption now had a protective boundary. The order of the belt had a solid foundation. Regal's protection was no longer empty talk. As Regal steadied, the entity fluctuated, as if recognizing what had happened. Then it fell silent and ceased to pry at his consciousness. Regulus knew he had passed a threshold. He had completed what this journey here was meant to accomplish. He had confirmed his own path. It might be slower, less efficient, but every step was walked by him. Regil continued to glow, gentle and steady. He withdrew from the presence and stood apart, thoughts rushing through him. What was that entity, really? Where had it come from? How long had it existed? And what civilization did it belong to? Had anyone besides Grindelwald come into contact with it, or had Grindelwald only known of its existence without truly engaging it? If one accepted the path it suggested, how powerful could one become? Would anyone surrender their self for power? Was becoming an efficient execution body for magic the ultimate aim of magic or its fallacy? There were no answers. The entity would not answer. It simply existed and demonstrated. He suspected it was sealed away. Perhaps not of this age, or perhaps the embodiment of a philosophy of magic. It had no inherent good or evil. It was simply a wholly different system of magical cognition, powerful, internally consistent, and deeply tempting, directly promising a route to greater power. But the cost was to be gradually stripped of emotion, preference, and the independent will that made Regulus who he was. He would not accept that. He must have a self-will. He did not want a self shaped unknowingly by outside forces. If he were to change, it would be a change he wanted, needed, and led after his own thought. Not this, not being led and transformed without knowing it. He wanted the path he chose to walk, not a path pointed out by others, even if it seemed straighter and wider. He shook his head and stopped dwelling on it. For now, Rigel had lit. He could feel his spirit and will growing together, solid, rooted growth, not poured in by an external force. There was no obvious change in his body yet, though he imagined there might be later. Otherwise, he had no immediate gains. He was neither stronger nor weaker, had not gained a new ability or lost an old one. The disintegration curse remained his disintegration curse. The Patronus remained his Patronus. Space Leap remained Space Leap. The entity had neither given nor taken. It had only shown him his path and another path, and that was enough. He did, however, come away with new ideas about space magic. The thing had spoken of inviting space, of letting space itself be willing to change for him. He could not understand that yet, much less do it, but he thought he could begin with something simple. Change how he addressed space, from it to you. A change in address might change cognition. Now, with Rigel lit and a deeper grasp of protection, could that understanding affect his perception of space magic? Could space itself be made into a form of protection? If he could anchor space into an unshakable existence, could it protect himself and others? These questions had no answers yet, but they pointed to a new direction. He withdrew his thoughts and turned. Freya was still standing not far behind him. Chapter 187. We Just Want to Talk. If one were to read only one Xianxia novel in a lifetime, it might be Regulus of Hogwarts, Lord of the Starry Sky. From the moment Regulus touched that mass of energy, Freya had been standing there. Time blurred for her. She didn't know how long she had waited. She simply stood motionless, watching him. Now that he finally moved, her expression changed. She studied his face, saw his eyes clear, his usual composure return, and that smile she had been growing used to still there. Freya let out a quiet, obvious sigh of relief. Her chest rose and fell noticeably. Seeing her, Regulus felt something stir in his chest. Whether it was concern for the mission or relief that he was unharmed, it was care. She had stood there long enough just to make sure he was all right. He nodded with a smile, then glanced at her as if to ask, "Want to try it?" In truth, he didn't want Freya to touch that thing. He wasn't sure she had as solid an identity as he did. It hadn't felt exceptionally difficult to him, not because his heart was unshakable or he was unaffected by temptations. Seeing that clearer, more powerful path had tempted him. But he believed he could reach or even surpass that height on his own. He simply believed in himself. He believed the path he had chosen was right, that it would lead him where he wanted to go, and that even if it was slower, the view at the end would be no worse than anyone else's. He couldn't say where that conviction came from, only that it was rooted deep and unshakable. If success or failure were measured by results, Regulus didn't know which he'd achieved. He hadn't gained power from the experience. And if someone else touched that mass and their arcane core was rebuilt, if they received guidance on a path or even gained a fundamental power at the cost of no longer being purely themselves, would that be success or failure? He tossed the thought aside. It was pointless. He only needed to believe in his own path. Others' choices were not his to make. But if everyone who touched that mass underwent the same reconstruction of their arcane core, he didn't know how much of Freya's magical system was truly her own. Could she be as firm in her path as he was? He didn't know, and he didn't want her to try. Still, he wouldn't make her choice for her. He could only be responsible for himself. Freya had to answer for herself. If she wanted to go, he would tell her what she might face, then let her decide. Freya understood the meaning in his eyes. She only gave a small, certain shake of her head. She didn't know exactly what the mass was or what would happen if she touched it, but she had a feeling she shouldn't, at least not now. The feeling wasn't a rational judgment, more an intuition. She'd had such instincts before. Someone had once said it was in the blood, less clear than his, perhaps, but trustworthy in critical moments. Like now, she trusted it. Regulus's smile widened at her answer. He said nothing more and nodded approval. Freya rolled her eyes inwardly and called him, in her head, Brat. They turned and headed back the way they'd come. As they crossed that glowing ground, the patterns flared beneath their feet as if lighting a farewell. When they reached the spot where they'd dropped in, Regulus reached for Freya and lifted her hands slightly. Her eyes widened as though she wanted to glare at him, but she took his hand anyway. Regulus cast a flying charm. The spell carried them upward and out of the water. When they passed through the invisible membrane, the mental pressure settled over them again. But instead of growing lighter as they rose, it started out extremely light, just like when they had first dove, and then intensified. Regulus understood immediately. Descending and ascending were two different processes. No matter the direction, one had to experience the full progression from light to heavy. It wasn't tied to actual sea depth. It was a ritual you had to go through. The pressure swelled like a tide, but this time Regulus could bear it. The light of Regil burned steadily in his mind. Blue-white, gentle, stable. When the pressure surged and struck that light, it split around it like a wave against a reef. The pressure remained, but could not shake him. He even had room to feel it, that cold, vast sense of existence that made one seem insignificant. It no longer threatened him. Freya's condition was steady as well. Blue light flashed occasionally in her eyes, clear as it cut through the dark waters. The two continued their ascent. In that zone, time and space blurred. Only the intensity of pressure measured depth. No light reached here. It was all dark, save for drifting bioluminescent plankton that briefly lit patches of water before dimming. Regulus suddenly stopped. Several dozen meters above, 5 figures were diving. He recognized one, the masked man 5. Even in the gloom, the dark red pattern on his mask showed faintly. Beside him floated the survivor who had escaped with him. Behind them hung 3 strangers. Magic perception told Regulus those 3 were stronger. Their arcane cores were heavy and cold, unlike the masked men they'd seen before, like the difference between deep ocean and shallow water. They were likely core members of the Abyssal Whisper. All 5 had bubblehead charms and shield charms active. Transparent domes covered their heads, and translucent barriers protected their bodies. Clearly, they weren't entering the mental pressure zone properly. They were just diving. Regulus knew they didn't have the sealed information, the coordinates or the name Sleeping Sea Abyss. They didn't know the place they hunted lay on the seabed. Or perhaps they did know and couldn't use it. All they could do was track. It made sense. The ocean was vast. If you could guess the general direction and find a stopped ship on the surface, you could locate the point where people had dived. But the mental pressure zone demanded permission to enter. The sealed documents were the key, something these men lacked, so they could only dive like ordinary mages. Regulus and Freya rose a little. The 5 above them descended. The 2 parties faced each other in the dark water, less than 20 meters apart. Masked Man 5's gaze fixed on Regulus, and the survivor beside him drifted back a little, memories of that invisible spell, that field of fiendfire, that burning island still fresh. The other 3 made no move, merely hanging and swaying with the current. This was not the moment for battle. Magic perception suggested even the weakest of those three rivaled Orion. Regulus and Freya were still within the pressure zone. Though both were steady, it would be foolish to fight opponents of that level this deep, especially opponents likely skilled in maritime combat. Their underwater fighting would not be poor. Regulus and Freya exchanged a look and, without words, acted on their tacit understanding. Apparition. The two vanished at once, leaving two empty bubbles that filled with seawater and dissolved. They reappeared on the ship's bow. The vessel was where they'd left it. Night had fallen. Moonlight spilled across the deck, the sea calm and flat. Regulus cast a drying charm. Water steamed off them in a warm wave. Freya did the same. Before they could fully recover, 5 figures appeared on the surface ahead. The abyssal whisper had followed them by apparition. The 5 stood on the sea, as if on solid ground, bodies rising and falling with the swell. Moonlight picked out their bone masks and the dense runes carved into them. The leader stepped forward, not Masked Man 5, but one of the 3 core members. The runes on his mask were deeper and more numerous, catching the moon with a dark glint. He raised his head to regard the 2 on the bow. His voice was old and coarse, as though he hadn't used it much. Miss Eisenhart, Mr. Black. His eyes swept Regulus and Freya in turn before settling on Regulus. Good evening. Regulus raised a brow. He wasn't surprised his name was known. The man had strong magical feedback and was clearly a leader. Of course he would collect information. Besides, Regulus's features were too conspicuous, his slightly curly hair, the gray eyes, so recognition was natural. Freya said nothing. With a flick of her wand, blue flames burst up around her, swirling and dancing, illuminating the sea ahead. She stood on the bow, looking down at the 5 with a stern glare. Regulus glanced at her, then drew on the power of Regal. In his mind, a protective visualization rose, a newly lit star sending blue-white light that merged into his arcane core and then into the fiend fire. Orange-red flames flared around him. As his will steadied, the flames changed. A tougher spirit let him exert deeper control over Fiendfire. A steadier will gave him stronger suppression. Fiendfire remained fiery and destructive, but in Regulus's hands it became more subdued. The orange-red layer twisted around him like a guardian, proactive rather than a passive shield, prepared to take anything aimed at him. It danced and circled almost in mirror to Freya's blue flames. Only the color differed. Regulus looked at himself, then at Freya. Their flames matched. Freya flicked him a brief glance. Her lips twitched, but she said nothing and continued to glare down. Regulus looked back at the 5 from the abyssal whisper. The tip of his wand in his right hand glowed gray-green. The first form of the disintegration curse was ready. His left hand was prepared too. He had already formed the casting prefix for the second form. Silent and unseen, the ripples could spread at any moment. The old voice below spoke again. We just want to talk about the thing down there. Chapter 188. Cannot be stolen, cannot be exchanged. Talk? Talk about what? Regulus looked down at the 5 people below. 2 of them stood at the very back, either intimidated and keeping their distance or simply too low in status to stand alongside the other 3. The man leading them, based on the 23 readings, was roughly at the level of a Hogwarts professor. But raw 23 alone meant little. Many 21 saw their grow stronger over time if they aged in good health. Real strength depended on spellcraft, understanding of 23, combat experience, and reactions under pressure. The man before them clearly wasn't just empty numbers. He stood on the sea's surface with his 20 like an undercurrent under calm waters, steady above, turbulent beneath. Regulus remembered what Freya had said when he first arrived in Reef Town about the abyssal whisper. They worshipped the deep, insisting that 23 be like the ocean, objective, vast, and swallowing individual noise. Their never felt cold, with an almost inhuman rationality. It reminded Regulus of the entity in the ruins, something more fundamental, something like a source. It didn't require individuals to possess free will. It wanted people to become part of a grander whole, for individual noise to vanish and everything to return to that cold system of 23. This did not seem like coincidence. The origins of the abyssal whisper, their philosophy and goals, were very likely linked to the ruins. Perhaps centuries ago, someone had taken something from those ruins and founded an organization built on it. Over time, the magical philosophy had grown into a faith and a goal. They might have located the ruins decades ago, only to be blocked by someone who had the document needed to enter, Grindelwald. After his failure, the document passed to the House of Eisenhart, and only this year reached Freya. So they had waited until Regulus came to Germany, until today, to the sleeping sea abyss. Thoughts flashed through Regulus's mind and receded. Now was not the time for conjecture. He stayed silent and let Freya handle the negotiations. He acted only as a deterrent. Fiendfire braided around him, the gray-green light at the tip of his scroll 24, flickering in and out. Freya's voice was cold. "What do you want to talk about?" The leader below looked somewhat helpless. Talk? He would have preferred to take the document outright. He could have stolen it, glanced at it, and returned it with apologies and lavish gifts. He could have offered treasures, magical items, secret knowledge, unique 23, relics from the deep, anything to buy a look. Or he could have traded something tempting, but none of that seemed feasible now. The two figures on the boat, one from the House of Eisenhart and one from the House of Black, were both from powerful, high-ranked families of the European wizarding world. The Black was the clear heir. Still, the leader of the Abyssal Whisper had nothing to fear personally. Their organization had endured for centuries. They might not match some pure-blood houses in prestige, but their power gave them the confidence to speak as equals. In his eyes, those pure-blood families were mired in petty power struggles, lineage, wealth, marriage alliances, ministry seats. The Abyssal Whisper pursued the truth of 23, knowledge drowned by time and traces of beings older than humanity. There was no comparison. But that witch, Freya, was different. The leader scrutinized the blue flames dancing around her. He had been skeptical when the island leader described them earlier. Colored flames could be conjured by many 21s. But seeing them now, he no longer doubted. He recognized the flame, its color, its shape, the way it burned, that aura of 23 that made people instinctively recoil. It was the same signature he had seen 30 years ago, Grindelwald. Grindelwald had been imprisoned in Nurmengard and absent from public view for nearly 30 years, but the mark of his era remained. If this flame was even remotely connected to him, Joachim von der Wilde dared not act rashly. And the boy from the House of Black, his fiendfire was clearly of an advanced order, and he was so young. From the island leader's description and what they had seen earlier, that area effect 2023 could easily turn matters into a nightmare for Joachim's organization if they failed to kill him at once. The Eisenhart witch beside him was no mere ornament. Robbing them was out of the question. Joachim had noticed something else when they first saw the two on the seawater. No protective enchantments, no bubblehead charm, no shield charm, while the 5 on his side were fully protected. That suggested the two had been inside the ruin. If so, they must know what was inside. Even a small talisman or a single spell from that place could benefit a person or a family for generations. It would be natural for them to refuse to share. Joachim forced a measured expression. He stepped forward and called up to the boat, his voice weathered by the sea. "My name is Joachim von der Wilde. I am the current director of the Abyssal Whisper. Miss Eisenhart, Mr. Black, I can trade everything the Abyssal Whisper has accumulated over hundreds of years, knowledge, wealth, information on other ruins, unique to the four, just for a look at that document." Every word was sincere, but Freya did not hesitate. Her tone left no room for negotiation. No, Joachim had expected that and remained unfazed. He had already noticed the blue flames waver and flare around Freya. Though they quickly curled back around her, he instinctively began gathering his own 23. He had lived through Grindelwald's time and remembered vividly how that man's flames consumed some and left others untouched. The witch's flames were far less powerful, just protective, but 23 was 23. The similarity alone warranted caution. Besides, this might not have been all she could do. Regulus, of course, did not volunteer information. He might even not have brought anything out, though his relaxed expression suggested otherwise. Joachim glanced at the fiendfire coiling about the black air. It all seemed manifest here. He could not rob them, and the answer to trade was a firm no. He turned to Regulus. "Mr. Black, What about you? Are you willing to trade? Regulus shook his head. The item was not his. He could not speak for Freya, and he was not the one to make the final decision. Joachim inhaled. He had expected a refusal, but he was not ready to concede. Hundreds of years, his organization had searched and waited, finally finding this place, only to be blocked by two young wizards. He was confident in his own strength, but they'd seen earlier that the pair could apparate. Unless they were killed in a single decisive blow, they could vanish anywhere and never be found on the open sea. They could not fight, could not rob, could not trade. A thought occurred to him. Wait. Now that they had confirmed the target was present, what could be done but wait? They were young. In time, they might need help, or their views might change. Better to wait a few decades than destroy everything now. The sea under Joachim's feet rippled and gathered, condensing into a jet of water that lifted him up and forward. The stream carried him to the height of the boat's bow, level with Freya and Regulus, less than 3 meters away. Regulus's face did not change. He stood motionless, simply watching the other man rise before him. But his magic perception was fully unfolded. The refinement of his star orbit meditation had greatly advanced his senses. He noted that the man had no intention of attacking. Still, Regulus did not let his guard down. An expert could conceal their 23 entirely and slip past his perception. The gray-green light at the tip of his 24 grew brighter. Joachim simply regarded them without any hostile movement. He drew something from his robes, the bleached remains of an unknown sea creature, palm-sized and faintly glowing with an eerie green light. It looked like the spine of a fish, each vertebra carved with fine, intricate patterns so delicate they might have been made by an artist. He raised the relic to his mouth and chanted under his breath. Regulus and Freya stayed perfectly still, watching him, every muscle ready. The surface of the relic shifted, the carvings darkened, and new patterns unfurled across it. After a time, the light dimmed. Joachim tossed it gently, and it floated until it hung suspended between Freya and Regulus. "Activate it," he said. "As long as you're at sea, the nearest members of our organization will sense it and answer the call." He said nothing further. No boast about what Abyssal Whisper could do, no explanation of their strengths or limits, not even a mention of the few who had died in their clash with him. He simply looked at them. Regulus understood the point. It was a gesture of friendship, of rapprochement, an offer of a link. He knew there would be times when he'd need to operate on these waters, the North Sea, the Baltic, the Norwegian Sea, the waters around Iceland. The ocean was vast, and in many places there were no wizarding settlements, only water, islets, and storms. Abyssal Whisper worked in those places year-round. Perhaps their reach extended even farther, the Atlantic, the Indian, the Pacific. They had been around for centuries, and most of their members were elites. Even those he had killed were not ordinary. At sea, they were a force to be reckoned with, the people who understood the rules best. The gulf between ordinary wizards and elite ones could be greater than that between a wizard and a muggle. Full trust was impossible, of course, but a limited contact could be established. Regulus also knew his standing with that organization wasn't high, even with Freya beside him. The House of Black and the House of Eisenhart were prominent across Europe, but Abyssal Whisper's sphere was primarily at sea, and their paths hardly crossed with the great houses. Even if the families wanted revenge, finding them in the open ocean would be nearly impossible, and even if they were found, a confrontation would be exorbitant in cost. In duels at that level, especially at sea, numbers mattered less than mobility. If you couldn't catch them, you couldn't, and if you couldn't stop them, you couldn't. Still, they had chosen to extend a hand. Why? Because of the ruins. Because of Grindelwald. It wasn't because of him. Regulus and Freya exchanged a brief, measured look. Freya reached out, took the floating relic into her hand, examined it, and handed it to Regulus. Joachim felt something stir inside him at the exchange, but said nothing. He bowed slightly, then apparated away. The other four followed, disappearing from the water's surface one by one until only the moonlight, the sea, and their ship remained. Freya turned the helm and headed back. In the cabin they sat opposite each other. Regulus toyed with the relic. It was light and warm to the touch, smooth like jade rather than bone, the new carvings faintly luminous. He looked up at Freya. Why give it to me? All the gains this time are yours, she said simply. Regulus paused. His intention? Freya hesitated, then nodded. Regulus understood then that the matter was not finished. There would be follow-ups. He let his thoughts trace the whole affair. Abyssal Whisper's knowledge that the documents were in House Eisenhart could easily have been arranged. A stray word dropped, carried over the sea, reaching Abyssal Whisper's ears, and they would come. The intermediary need not be directly involved, need not command. They merely needed to understand how things would unfold. He thought of Grindelwald's foresight, how he had seen what Regulus might become, a future that might diverge from Grindelwald's desires. A wizard's final form was shaped by experience, by the magic they mastered, by the paths they chose. Magic changed those who used it. Prolonged use of dark arts could harden a person. Over-reliance on the Patronus charm could make someone unduly optimistic. Constant healing could make one unable to bear suffering. The future was linear and developmental, molded by countless choices and small events. If you could influence someone at a key node, for Regulus, this episode might have been one such node. Grindelwald had set up the mental corrosion through Abyssal Whisper, letting Regulus experience that kind of attack. He had Freya bring Regulus to the Sleeping Sea Abyss to confront the artifact's reconstructive and cognitive influence. But Grindelwald had not forced him, he had only prepared the stage. Whether Regulus walked the road was his choice. He had walked it, and apparently gained something, at least for now. Since Grindelwald had been aware of the Sleeping Sea Abyss and its documents for some time, he almost certainly knew Abyssal Whisper's origins. Drawing them in might have been intended to keep a line of contact open with Regulus. Regulus shook his head inwardly. Perhaps he was overthinking. He lacked the wider perspective and could only proceed one step at a time. He found Freya watching him. The look was familiar. The same expression she'd worn the night she wanted to ask about the disintegration curse. Curious, wanting to ask, too shy to speak. Regulus smiled and began to tell her about the ruins, how the thing appeared, how it existed in his consciousness, how it deconstructed his magic one piece at a time and showed him an alternate path. He described how he met those reconstructions, how he reasoned, and how he responded. Freya listened, thoughtful. It confirmed why she had hesitated to intervene. She wasn't sure she could remain steady under that level of cognitive assault. If she had been led astray onto that cold path of self-consumption, she drew a breath and asked, carefully, watching his reaction. "Aren't you angry?" She hadn't meant to ask it outright at first. She had thought he might feel honored that someone of Grindelwald's caliber had taken the trouble to arrange things for a 12-year-old from another house. But now, after everything, after they'd become acquainted, she wondered whether he might be upset at being manipulated. She didn't want to lose the friend she had found. Regulus met her gaze and shook his head gently. "Not angry. On the contrary, I'm grateful." Freya looked puzzled for a beat. She had expected affected magnanimity or awkward irritation, not genuine gratitude. She searched his face and found no pretense. His eyes held nothing hidden. He truly wasn't angry. She relaxed and, despite her formal posture, back straight, arms folded on the table, she looked almost cute in her primness. She asked another question. "Did you gain anything?" Regulus considered. Star orbit meditation was his foundation. Even though he trusted Freya, he couldn't tell her everything. He made a small fist and opened it. In his palm lay a tiny egg, orange-red like embers, the shell etched with fine patterns. The shell cracked and a small bird emerged, shook its feathers, flapped once, and settled on his fingertip. It was like the one he'd had before, and yet slightly different. It blinked at Freya, then at Regulus, and pecked at its own plumage. Orange sparks flew and winked out immediately. "Some forms of magic tied to mental will have improved," Regulus said. "Controlling fiend fire with thought, suppressing it by sheer will, things that used to require effort have become easier." Seeing the faint light in Freya's eyes, he added, "And I trust myself more." The implication was there, and he left it at that. Freya accepted it without pressing. They sat quietly, listening to the sea against the hull. The journey that had been dressed as a family errand ended here. By the time they reached Reef Town, the far sea had a pale gold sheen. They disembarked, walked the stone path, and stopped at the door of the little cabin by the shore. "Good night, Freya." "Good night, Regulus." Chapter 190. Dumbledore won't let me play with you. Regulus lay in bed, unable to sleep. His head was full of too much information, surging like the waves outside the cabin, one memory washing into the next. The last few days had been a blur, meeting Freya on the first day, encountering the Abyssal Whisper, learning the second form of the disintegration curse, the burning island, the sleeping sea abyss, and that presence. Where had that thing come from? How long had it existed? Thousands of years, tens of thousands, or even longer before humanity. When it conveyed its knowledge, it felt utterly natural, as if every spell in the modern wizarding world and every system connected to them already existed inside it. That was why it could line up with everything and point to alternate paths for each. Those paths had been there all along. It merely indicated doors that were already open. Regulus could only guess. What had Grindelwald done when he faced that entity years ago? He must have gone in with that document. Which path had Grindelwald chosen? Had he listened and then walked his own way, or had he taken one of the paths shown to him? What had he seen about the future? What kind of man was he there? A powerful wizard? A leader? Something else? If Grindelwald hadn't interfered, how would Rigel have ignited? Might it have ignited one day on its own, given the right opportunity? He couldn't say. He remembered Joachim's reaction when Freya's blue flames flared. His 19 coalesced instantly. It wasn't fear of Freya. It was that symbol's significance itself that triggered the response. Grindelwald stood near the pinnacle of humanity, one of the most powerful people on the planet. That blue flame marked him. To see it was to think of him. Regulus wondered what it would mean if he ever reached that level. If he could leave a mark on the world, a signature of power that would make others tense simply by seeing it. Right now, the only thing truly unique to him, the only spell entirely of his own making, was the disintegration curse. If he tried to make that his mark, he pictured the second form of the disintegration curse at low power, spreading silently. Wherever it passed, people would feel sick, nauseous, dizzy, wanting to vomit or faint, but unable to. If it happened often enough, perhaps it would come to mean anything unpleasant. A headache, a fever, a cold, nausea. Anything that made you feel unwell would be suspected as his work. Even Regulus felt the image was off. But the thought pushed him deeper. Sound waves carried spells quickly, but over very long distances, sound was inadequate. From Britain to the continent to the Americas, sound would take a long time or simply fail to travel that far. Atmospheric attenuation would weaken it until it vanished. Then he thought of radio waves. They were also waves. What if electromagnetic waves could replace sound as the transmission medium? The difference would be enormous. Light-speed transmission, 300,000 kilometers per second, only a fraction of a second to circle the Earth. Putting aside whether the idea itself was feasible, if it were possible, he might need only a few 19 satellites. 3 would cover the globe. With the right control, a single thought could make every living thing on Earth feel sick at once or die at once. Only the most skilled wizards, people in fortified bunkers, or creatures with potent magical defenses would survive. One person as a global deterrent. He shook his head. From idea to reality was a chasm. How could electromagnetic waves carry 19? How to prevent attenuation? How to control precise release from hundreds of thousands of kilometers away? The wizarding world had never built magic satellites. They lacked the theory, the know-how to launch or maintain orbit, and how to stop them being shot down. More fundamentally, would 19 behave at all over such distances? Would a spell's effect attenuate with distance? Each question would demand years, perhaps a lifetime of research. Even if the concept could guide him, the path to making it work was littered with impossible obstacles. And if he succeeded, he would be a global menace. Wizard and muggle alike would not tolerate such a thing. He pushed those thoughts away. He was getting ahead of himself. He thought of Freya. It had been less than a month, but felt longer, as if they'd known each other for years. The days on patrol, the quiet dinners at the tavern, the unspoken understanding that needed no words. Some people you live beside for years and barely know, others you meet for days and feel you've known a lifetime. Freya was the latter. He could have stayed in that easy island life, patrolling, going out to sea, researching 19, bickering with her. No Voldemort, no Death Eaters, nothing demanding constant vigilance. But he couldn't stay. Britain's heavy air and its obligations were where he belonged. The House of Black was there. That was home. He wasn't rushed to finalize the changes that Rigel's full ignition or further refinement of star orbit meditation might bring. He let his mind settle and his star orbit move. 5 stars returned to their places. Betelgeuse burned, Rigel guarded, and Orion's belt connected. He smoothed his thoughts and slept. When he woke, it was evening. The sun slipped toward the western horizon, laying a golden path across the sea. Clouds, layer on layer, were dyed orange and red to the edge of the world. Regulus straightened his clothes and stepped out of the cabin. Freya stood at the cliff's edge, back to him, looking out over the sea. Her platinum braids swayed in the breeze. The afterglow warmed her dark gray hunting outfit. He joined her. They stood shoulder to shoulder. He was a head shorter and had to tilt up to see her profile, but together they didn't feel out of place, 2 young people at different stages of growth. The sunset threw their shadows long across the ground. Neither spoke. Regulus knew this was goodbye. Less than a month, few days in truth, yet it had felt full. After a long silence, Freya spoke first. "Keep that skeleton." Regulus looked at the sea. "I know." "That's not what I mean," she said, turning her head and lowering her gaze. "I mean, when you use it, they can sense its location. Don't go messing around with it for no reason." He smirked. "Afraid I'll get bored at night and try to chat with them?" She glared, sharp but not truly angry. For 2 seconds, she held it. Then the corner of her mouth betrayed her, and she quickly suppressed it. From her bosom, she drew a small glass vial, no bigger than a thumb, filled with a pinch of powder. The gray-blue dust glittered with tiny star-like specks in the fading light, like a scrap of night sky trapped in glass. She handed it to him. "Take it. It doesn't matter if you can't figure it out." He held it up to the light. The powder was almost smoke, so fine he could barely see individual grains, and he slid the vial into his pocket. "And what if I do figure it out?" She didn't answer. Instead, she turned back to the ocean and fell silent for a moment. "Actually, that person asked me to pass a message to you." Regulus raised an eyebrow. "Oh, he said when you are ready, you can come see him." Something stirred in Regulus's chest. Ready for what? Ready in power or in purpose? He kept his expression neutral. "Ready for what?" Freya looked toward the distant horizon. "He said, you'll know, and he will know too." Regulus smiled at the riddle. "What if Dumbledore won't let me?" Freya glanced at him without answering. He tried again, more lightly. "What if I can't go because I haven't finished my homework?" Her eyes widened as if double-checking she'd heard him right. Homework? In the middle of a conversation about Grindelwald? The corner of her mouth twitched. She took a steadying breath. Her chest rose and fell. Sometimes Regulus, who was usually so serious, said things that left her at a loss for how to respond. Either she didn't want to or couldn't be bothered. Finally, she said bluntly, "If, when you go to see him, you feel uncomfortable, tell me." Her words came abruptly and without context, but Regulus understood. Chapter 191, Dumbledore's Style. Do you like it? No matter how well prepared, no matter how strong Regulus had become, facing someone of Grindelwald's caliber was something no one could guarantee going in. He might be suppressed, influenced, or only notice something was wrong after returning. Grindelwald was not Dumbledore. Regulus had met Dumbledore, heard his counsel, felt his methods. He didn't claim a deep understanding, but he felt at ease around him. Grindelwald, by contrast, existed for Regulus only in second-hand records, book entries, other people's descriptions, old newspapers. The picture that emerged from those scraps was too blurred. An immensely powerful wizard, a loser, an old man locked away, a man who once stirred all of Europe. None of those impressions captured him. At Grindelwald's level, people could no longer be judged simply as good or evil. They fell into 2 categories, those who were useful and those who weren't. If you were useful, you would be placed. If not, you wouldn't even deserve an audience. Regulus was being placed, being shown to Grindelwald, and resources were being invested in him. That meant one thing. In Grindelwald's eyes, Regulus was useful. Useful for what, to become what, and when or where he would be needed, those were unknown. But Freya would be on his side. Regulus looked at her seriously and nodded. Understood. The summer sun had slipped low, the sea reflecting the waning glow. They stood for a moment in the cooling light. Freya opened her mouth as if to say something, then shook her head. "Never mind. I'll tell you next time." Regulus didn't press her. She handed him a portkey, a silver coin etched with runes. He didn't take it. A tug rose inside him, a tug that came from his Patronus. Since Rigel had lit up, his understanding of protection had deepened. Protection was not only defense, not only blocking, not only standing in front of danger. It could be a gesture, an expression, a way to put someone at ease. A Patronus is a reflection of the self, what it desired, he desired. Right now, that silvery bird was beating its wings deep in his consciousness. It wanted to fly. It wanted to take him with it. It wanted to leave in its own way. Regulus looked at Freya and smiled, part smug, part show-off. Before he left, he wanted to leave an impression, not only for her, but perhaps for whoever might be watching. Dumbledore style, do you like it? The starry sky kite surged from his chest in a wash of silvery white light. Wings spread, starlight scattered. It shone brighter than it ever had, every feather distinct, every filament of light alive. It circled over Freya's head, casting starlight across her hair, her shoulders, the braids at her back. Freya froze. She looked up at the circling bird, eyes wide. The starlight draped over her like a fine veil. Her expression shifted through layers, confusion, then recognition, then disbelief. Of course she knew what this was, a corporeal Patronus. She knew the shape, too. She had recognized it the first time she'd seen it, the starry sky kite, a magical creature that could traverse space. This was something that could rival a phoenix, Dumbledore's phoenix. Her lips parted as she stared at the bird, at the falling light, at the boy beside her. The starry sky kite finished its circuit, then flapped hard. The silver glow intensified as if something had been kindled. It dove toward Regulus and merged with him. Light enveloped him, coiled about his body like a living cocoon, and then it vanished. Only motes of starlight drifted down, settling on Freya's hair and shoulders. She stood motionless for a long moment. Finally, she looked at her fingers where a faint glow still lingered. Then back to the spot Regulus had occupied. He was gone. She opened her mouth and made no sound. Then, unexpectedly, she laughed, long and loud, shoulders shaking. Then she fell silent again, staring into the distance, an unreadable expression on her face. Regulus traveled through a passage. The starry sky kite cut a path through space as if finding a road that had always been there. The scenery smeared around him, punctuated by bright flashes like distant stars. The kite's method of travel was nothing like apparition. It was gentler, as if asking space to yield. He felt it was somewhat like the invitation that thing had once spoken of. 12 Grimmauld Place. He perceived the old house clearly, and something else. A barrier like a wall wrapped the house, an anti-apparition charm, and other wards sealing space. Apparition could not penetrate. The starry sky kite was different. Regulus let it press on. As it touched the barrier, he felt a resistance, like moving through thick water or stepping into dense fog. The barrier slowed it, but didn't stop it. It pierced through. A moment later, Regulus stood on solid ground in a study. 12 Grimmauld Place, Orion's study. Orion sat behind his desk. Before either of them could speak, before they could meet eyes, Orion's figure vanished. One moment he was there, the next, gone. Regulus didn't sense any spatial rippling or shadow. Then something cold and firm pressed against the small of his back. A wand, magic condensed at its tip, tightly wound and on the verge of firing. The nature of that spell was clear in an instant. Cold, pure, murderous. The killing curse. A flicker of surprise shot through Regulus. The reaction had been too fast. From the moment he landed to having a wand pressed to his back, there had been almost no interval. How had Father done that? A voice came from behind. Regulus? Regulus didn't move. Father, it's me. The pressure eased for a moment, and then the wand was withdrawn. Orion stepped out from behind the desk, circled to the front, and looked him over with a complicated expression, anger, relief, and bewilderment all at once. Regulus understood the reaction. Orion knew better than anyone how tight the old house's defenses were. No one had breached them like that in years. The intrusion had not triggered the usual warnings, and the intruder was suddenly standing in the study. As head of the family, Orion must have sensed the breach and responded instantly with a killing curse, decisive and fast. Regulus felt a twinge of guilt. He had meant to surprise his father, not scare him half to death. Orion walked back to his desk and sat, waving the wand in a dismissive gesture. The prickly feeling he'd felt on landing, the sense of being watched or attacked, vanished. Orion pointed at the armchair opposite him. "Sit." Regulus sat. Orion regarded him with an expectation that made Regulus uneasy. Less than a month away on a family mission, and his son returned having broken through all the old house's wards. What had happened to him? How was the mission? Regulus began to speak. On the first day there had been combat. He'd killed one man using the first form of his disintegration curse. He told his father how the masked man had reacted, how he severed his own left shoulder and regenerated, and how the enemy had used close-quarters hexes, attaching enchanted sigils to their fists. He described going after one of the enemy strongholds after 10 days, using the second form of the disintegration curse to kill 2 men, and setting fiendfire loose to burn 3 others to ashes. He told of the island going up in flames, of 2 survivors, and of the rest gone. Orion listened without interruption, but his expression grew puzzled. That was it? Of course he had no moral outrage at his son killing. Regulus's attitude toward killing was already clear from last year in Nocturne Alley. This was more a verification. The disintegration curse itself, especially the second form, silent, shadowless, area effect, was impressive. A wizard who could develop such a spell had reason to be proud. The Fiendfire's behavior was as to be expected. Out-of-control Fiendfire was just that. But none of this explained the intrusion into the old house. Regulus finished and lowered his head to think. There were things he needed to coordinate with his father about Grindelwald, a wizard of a different order entirely, on a level with Dumbledore and Voldemort, and in some eyes more influential than either. If this were only his business, he could handle it alone, but involving Grindelwald could affect the whole House of Black. His father had to know. Regulus looked up at Orion. "Father, there are some other matters about this mission." Orion arched a brow and leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk, inviting him to continue. Regulus began to speak, the magical properties and concepts behind the abyssal whisper, what he had discovered and the deductions he'd drawn, and Grindelwald's involvement. That document had been in Grindelwald's hands for decades. He must have accessed it. He had passed it to the House of Eisenhart, to Freya, and set events in motion that brought Regulus to Germany. The appearance of the abyssal whisper, that force of mental erosion, that trial, none of it had been random. Then there was the sleeping sea abyss, that core of unknown origin, how it had bled into his consciousness, how it had dismantled that erosion piece by piece, and how it had shown him another path. He described his own response, careful not to mention the star orbit meditation, focusing instead on the development of his mental will and his conviction in the path he had chosen. From the clues, he guessed Grindelwald might have seen something in him. But perhaps the future that Grindelwald had anticipated was not the one Grindelwald wanted, so he had acted at key moments to steer things. Orion listened, his face folding into an expression that was hard to name. He had always known his son was extraordinary, since Regulus began casting spells without words and wandless, since he developed space leap, since he met Lord Voldemort's dark enlightenment with calm, and since he devised the disintegration curse. But Grindelwald, this name carried a different weight from Dumbledore or Lord Voldemort. Dumbledore could be a mentor and guardian, Voldemort a destroyer and threat, but Grindelwald was a reformer, an emblem of an era. The Acolytes, the Great War in Europe, the shaken international statute of secrecy, countless people had rallied to his banner. He had failed, yes, but his followers had not vanished. The ideas he spread still lived on. He'd been imprisoned, but not dead. Now, nearly 30 years after his disappearance, he was stirring again, and his attention had been drawn to Regulus. Orion regarded his son, only 12, sitting across from him, speaking about these matters with a calm, everyday tone, and could not help but be impressed by the depth folded into those words. Any single piece of what Regulus had just said would occupy an ordinary wizard for half a day. Dumbledore's interest might be an understandable coincidence. A headmaster taking special notice of a student was plausible. Voldemort's presence could be explained away too. The two of them at odds, tugging the House of Black into their orbit, was not impossible. But with Grindelwald added to the mix, the whole picture changed. Orion was silent for a long moment, then asked, "What do you think?" Regulus paused. There was little more to say about Voldemort and Dumbledore. One courted him openly, the other eroded him from the shadows. Their intentions were clear, and he had dealt with both. Maintaining the status quo for now was acceptable, but Grindelwald, though defeated and apparently gone, had not killed his ideas. Those ideals, those concepts of erosion, of the world and order, still resided in people's hearts. If Grindelwald ever called, there would be no shortage of responders. They were merely waiting. Regulus looked Orion in the eye. "A triangle is the most stable." Orion blinked, then considered the remark. Regulus went on, "But that's just theory. Right now, I'm only a character in someone else's arrangement. I can't have an equal conversation with these figures, nor can I make fully independent choices. I can only endure. Only the manner of my endurance matters, whether I go along willingly or resist while pretending to comply." Orion said nothing. The study stretched quiet. He leaned back and tapped his fingers against the desk. Further discussion had little practical value. Regulus was right. At present, he was being positioned. Without an equal footing, he could only endure. The real difference lay in how he endured. But there was time for development. Judging by Regulus's recent trajectory, he made noticeable progress every so often. The improvement in his mental will might seem abstract to an ordinary wizard, but to a truly gifted one, mental will underpinned so much. Mana control, spell augmentation, resistance to interference, soul stability, endurance in prolonged combat, whether in advanced dark or light arts, all of it rested on that foundation. Regulus no longer fit the category of ordinary. Grindelwald's intentions might be opaque, but for the moment his influence had been beneficial to Regulus, and what benefited Regulus benefited the House of Black. Orion let the thought drop. How could he possibly see through Grindelwald's designs? For now, one fact was clear. Regulus had entered the field of view of the most powerful people in the world. Dumbledore, Voldemort, Grindelwald, each treated him differently, but all courted him or arranged things around him. And as Regulus had said, a triangle was the most stable. If they remained cautious, the House of Black might still be able to maneuver within it. Orion lifted his eyes. Regulus sat with his gaze lowered, thinking. The holidays were almost over. It was mid-August, and the term would start in 10 days. All the plans for the break had been accomplished. The disintegration curse had been successfully developed. Rigel had been fully lit. His Patronus had evolved, and Fiendfire was under better control than before. The results had even exceeded expectations. He didn't plan to go anywhere else, just stay home and digest what lighting Rigel had brought him. There wasn't much left to refine in the disintegration curse. It was essentially a finished spell. The two forms had been tested, and future work was repetition and practice. The Patronus had seen major advancement. That trip had proven it. The guardian image of Rigel had echoed the Patronus, and Rigel's full illumination fed back into the Patronus, prompting a natural evolution. The starry sky kite was no mere corporeal Patronus. It was a legendary magical creature in its own right, gifted with space traversal talent. Previously, that ability belonged only to the kite. Now it could take Regulus with it. Much like Dumbledore's Phoenix, it could become a trump card in future danger. Fiendfire had grown more manageable. When it twirled around him, the flames behaved like obedient beasts, not lashing out or spinning chaotically. That, however, held true only when it remained near him. Released at a distance, dozens of meters as before, it might still lose some control, though not to the catastrophic degree it had last time. He would need an opportunity to test it properly, preferably with someone to cooperate and an object to try burning. The next focus should be space magic. He had no intention of following the path pointed out by the thing in the sleeping sea abyss. Having refused it, he wouldn't go back. But the direction it suggested could be explored. The idea was to let space cease being merely an object to manipulate and become a partner to coexist with. That line of thinking was worth pursuing. Professor McGonagall's notes on transfiguring space itself offered another route, compatible and possibly combinable with his ideas. The starry sky kite's traversal hadn't torn space. It had made space yield, like an invitation. Coupled with his earlier concept of combining space and protection, using space itself to form barriers, these clues converged into a research path he could pursue for a long time. Even small breakthroughs there would be monumental. Finally, there was the Dark Enlightenment, Voldemort's gift. Regulus sank his awareness deep and reached for the containment room in his mental world. Looking through the observation window, he saw the virtual personality behaving differently. The simulated Regulus stood in the center of the chamber, a shadowy mist seeping from its whole body, causing havoc. It wasn't trying to escape, that would violate its base directives, but it was venting. The fragments of knowledge the virtual personality had extracted from the Dark Enlightenment during their first contact had been exhausted. Its curiosity and analytical nature drove it to seek more. Unable to obtain it, it grew irritable. It paced the room, waving its hands and scattering the shadowy mist, sometimes stopping to mutter curses at the air. Regulus couldn't make out the words clearly, but matching them to his own vocabulary, he imagined they were quite foul. He watched for a time and chose not to intervene. He would observe for another 2 days to see if anything alarming surfaced. After all, this was Voldemort's domain. Caution was never misplaced. With his current mental strength, could he resist its corrosion? The thought flared, and he suppressed it. Even if he could withstand it, he wouldn't risk his main consciousness to test the edge. That thing was an addictive mental narcotic. A tainted main mind could cause irreparable harm. A virtual personality could be rebuilt if it broke. His core could not. Orion's voice drew him back from the deeper thread of thought. You make your own decisions. Regulus raised his head. Orion's face was calm, his tone steady. Do as you wish. Don't burden yourself too much with affairs at home. The words were simple. Their meaning was clear. He trusted Regulus. And in truth, with the attention Regulus was drawing from Dumbledore, Voldemort, and Grindelwald, Orion could provide little help. These people were interested in Regulus himself, not in the House of Black. Then again, so what? This was his son, and his son was a Black. The thought tugged at the corner of Orion's mouth. Regulus nodded then, seeing his father's expression, asked something else. How is Sirius? Is his training going well? The slight lift at the corners of Orion's mouth flattened. By any reasonable measure, Sirius had made obvious progress. Compared to boys his age from other families, he was excellent. But who was asking? Regulus. One son had surpassed peers to the point that calling him merely excellent seemed inadequate, while the other still measured himself against them. As a father, Orion felt the gap between his sons with a harsh clarity. He gave no expression. He still needs practice. On September 1st, in the dining room of 12 Grimmauld Place, sunlight filtered through the heavy curtains in pale strips across the long table. When Regulus entered, Sirius was already seated, a rare sight. Since returning from Germany, Regulus's days had been erratic: bedroom, library, and training. His schedule was packed, and he seldom came down for meals. Kreacher would bring his plates up. Sirius hardly used the dining room either, but for different reasons. The house felt oppressive to him, and he preferred to find food in the kitchen rather than sit under Walburga's gaze. Today, though, being the first day of term, he could not avoid it. Regulus sat opposite Sirius and glanced at him. He had lost some weight, but his color was better. The tense agitation that had marked him at the start of the holidays was gone, replaced by something steadier. Hawke had taught him much over the break and arranged other training. Whatever Regulus had learned had shown. Walburga entered and took her usual place. Then Orion seated himself at the head of the table and picked up a newspaper. Kreacher brought breakfast: bacon, fried eggs, toast, and pumpkin juice. Walburga's eyes rested on Regulus first. Rel, eat more, she said, pushing the plate of bacon toward him. When you go back to school, you won't have the same careful attention you have here. Professor Slughorn is decent, but he isn't one of our own. Regulus nodded and took a piece. Remember to write, Walburga went on. Bella wrote asking after you, said that the Dark Lord is very concerned with your progress. You must do well at school. Don't bring shame on the House of Black. Regulus nodded again. He knew what Lord Voldemort's concern meant. The Dark Enlightenment. Honor, Walburga insisted. Never forget the honor of the House of Black. What you're doing at school is right, exactly as it should be. Her gaze swept over Sirius with undisguised contempt, as if looking at something filthy. Some people think that by leaving they can break from the family. That's a pipe dream. Sirius gave no reaction. He kept his head down and ate, cutting his egg with knife and fork, expressionless. He did not argue, throw his plate, or perform the outraged theatrics he once might have. He simply ignored her. The old Sirius would have exploded, sneering, hurling insults at pureblood nonsense, then slamming out the door. Now he did nothing. Regulus knew it wasn't restraint. Sirius simply didn't care anymore. Walburga glanced at him occasionally, eyes full of disgust. When he finished, he wiped his mouth, stood, and left. Regulus continued his breakfast. Orion hadn't spoken, only flipping the newspaper and sipping pumpkin juice. After the meal, Walburga added a few more reminders: honor, status, the regard of the Dark Lord. Regulus listened and assented to each point. Orion came over and patted his shoulder. "Go." Regulus stood. "Mother, I'm leaving." Walburga smiled at him, eyes proud. Regulus went to the foyer, where Creature waited. The house elf shot a look at Sirius, an expression of that subtle contempt an elf feels for an unworthy scion. But since Sirius was still a master, Creature dared not speak. The next instant, Grimmauld Place vanished. They opened their eyes to find themselves near the entrance to Platform 9th floor at King's Cross. Steam rose, crowds swirled, and owls hooted. Sirius looked at him in a way Regulus could not quite name, neither hostile nor friendly. Finally, Sirius nodded. "Goodbye, Regulus." It wasn't a casual goodbye. It felt like a final farewell. He turned and walked on toward the platform where the Potters stood waiting. When James saw Sirius, a wide grin spread across his face and he waved excitedly. Sirius's entire manner changed, relaxed and bright in a way it never was at Grimmauld Place. James slipped an arm around his shoulders, and they headed into the crowd laughing. Regulus turned away. As he stepped toward the platform entrance, he noticed Barty Crouch standing not far off, the head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, one of the hardliners who refused compromise with Voldemort's opponents. At his side stood a boy of about 10, neatly dressed and grave-faced, Barty Crouch Jr. In time, that boy would use Polyjuice Potion to impersonate Moody, stay a year at Hogwarts without being discovered, take his medicines under Snape's nose, and carry out a plan that would end in killing his own father. He had will, ability, and an obsessive loyalty that Voldemort trusted with the most important tasks. Regulus felt nothing on his face, but inwardly he thought, "Barty Crouch Jr., come be my son." What future is there simply following Lord Voldemort? You only need a father you can admire. He walked over, bowed slightly, and said politely, "Mr. Crouch." Crouch looked him over with a cold, appraising glance, the kind that sized up potential allies or suspects. He knew who Regulus was, the heir of the House of Black, a rising Slytherin, someone Voldemort's side would take note of. The Ministry's intelligence would not miss that. He didn't offer anything warm, only a nod. Black. Regulus took the nod as enough. The pro-war faction at the Ministry and Voldemort's supporters were practically at open odds. In Crouch's eyes, Regulus belonged to that side. A response at all meant Crouch wasn't venting his resentment on a mere young wizard. A voice called his name. "Regulus!" He turned to see Avery waving. Regulus nodded, scanning the crowd. Alex was there too, standing with a middle-aged couple, gentle, refined people with kind faces. Alex pointed Regulus out to them, and the man approached with a formal, outstretched hand. "Mr. Black," he said, "I am Alex's father. He speaks of you often." Regulus shook his hand. "Mr. Rosier." Their brief exchange drew a few curious looks from other young wizards nearby, Regulus talking to an adult as naturally as if he were one himself. To them it was both novel and slightly distant, someone who could stand before grown men without awkwardness. Regulus didn't notice the attention. He chatted politely with Mr. Rosier, who thanked him for keeping an eye on Alex. Regulus demurred that Alex worked hard on his own. He joined Avery and Alex by a carriage door. Alex kissed his parents goodbye and bounded into the compartment. The three found an empty one and sat. Avery leaned back with a relieved sigh. "Finally, term started. How were your holidays?" Before Regulus could answer, Avery launched into his own account. "I spent a month in France, our estate in Provence, vineyards, lavender fields, and a greenhouse for magical plants. Mum says the climate's right for breeding a certain butterfly, so she made me learn how to care for them all day." Alex interrupted eagerly. I went to Germany, to a magical zoo. Have you ever seen a 16-legged lizard? And there are birds that change color while they fly, suddenly from red to blue, and you'd think they were different birds. He spoke with shining eyes. Regulus listened, nodding and murmuring the occasional, though his thoughts were elsewhere. He had been in Germany too, Reef Town, the North Sea, the Sleeping Sea Abyss, the Abyssal Whisper, and Freya, but his experiences had been entirely different from theirs. He didn't say anything about it. He let them talk. On the platform, the crowd thickened as departure time neared. In the corridor, two figures passed by their compartment door, Lily and Severus Snape, walking with a step's distance between them. Lily's face looked slightly unhappy. Snape's mouth was set, and his eyes stared ahead, not at her. When they reached the door, Lily seemed about to call him back, but Snape had already gone on toward another compartment. She watched his retreating back for a moment, then turned away. Regulus observed them both. Snape and Lily couldn't be openly close at school. Gryffindor and Slytherin, different circles, and Snape's new contacts who might be future Death Eaters. He suspected Snape had spent the holiday learning more of the dark arts. Power could stop Potter and his friends from crowding him out. It could let Snape shed the shabby image from Nocturne Alley and squeeze into that inner Slytherin circle. Lily, sharp as she was, likely disapproved. Two opposed philosophies were rubbing painfully together. The friendship remained, but it had already begun to crack. Regulus looked away, but the moment he did, Lily suddenly turned her head. Lily spotted Regulus in the carriage, but just as he was about to nod, she shot him a glare and walked straight past. Regulus understood that look. She was annoyed. He froze for a beat, then remembered. Before the holidays, he'd promised to write to Lily. Then he'd practiced a little, received Lord Voldemort's gift, developed spells, gone to Germany, met Freya, entered the ruins, and lit Rigel. So many things had happened that he had simply forgotten. Avery and Alex watched from the side, exchanging looks and smirks. When Regulus glanced their way, they straightened immediately, faces composed again. Regulus didn't worry much. Young girls were easy to mollify. A quick apology would fix it. At that moment, Hermes came in, and Regulus looked up. Hermes had not been idle over the break either. There was a faint aura about him that ordinary people might not notice, but which Regulus detected easily. Compared with Avery and Alex, the residue of dark arts practice around Hermes was unmistakable. It wasn't mere exercise, more like real, practical experience. Hermes sat opposite them and looked at Regulus first. "Good holiday?" he asked. "Not bad," Regulus replied. Hermes then turned to Avery and Alex, exchanging the usual pleasantries in an indifferent tone, his eyes drifting as if occupied. Regulus could see Hermes had changed. Being around ordinary young students made him feel out of place, like the holiday anecdotes were suddenly distant. Avery and Alex continued talking, oblivious, until Regulus said, "Tone it down, it's too obvious." They stopped, confused. Who was being told not to talk about the holidays? They followed Regulus's gaze and realized he meant Hermes. Hermes blinked, then fell quiet. Regulus felt the dark aura around him begin to contract and hide. Most people would never notice. The students at Hogwarts were not ordinary, and Hermes was learning self-control. Regulus said no more. The train started. Outside the window, the platform slid away as dusk fell. At Hogsmeade Station, they followed the crowd off the train. Regulus sat in a carriage and watched the Thestrals pulling it, black and skeletal, heads like dragons on horse-like bodies, enormous wings folded at their sides. He had not been able to see them before, but now he could. Everyone in the wizarding world knew the saying, only those who have seen death can see Thestrals. But Regulus found himself thinking beyond the proverb. Why death? Thestrals survive storms, break through magical barriers, and are said to travel briefly through space. They weather the harshest nights. Do they symbolize that only those who have died, or those who have faced death, can possess such abilities? Or is death itself a threshold, something you cross when you witness life collapse into absence, and crossing it gives you a perspective that pierces appearances to see essence? Witnessing death, accepting it, understanding it, perhaps those stages explain why some can see Thestrals. And if one could go further, surpass death itself, what would one perceive? Regulus quietly recited the French phrase he'd heard, Voldemort, flight from death. and then the name it suggested, Voldemort. He pulled his thoughts back and shifted his gaze away. He could not ask Voldemort whether he had succeeded in such a thing. He noticed Hermes watching the Thestrals too. Their eyes met. No words were needed. Hermes had seen death as well. Regulus didn't know what Hermes had done over the holidays, but whatever it was, it had been significant enough to change him. Avery and Alex continued their chatter, unaware. The Thestrals trotted toward Hogwarts. In the night, the castle's silhouette became clearer, and Regulus saw more protective enchantments woven around it than before. Anti-dark arts wards, Dementor-repelling charms, Protego Totalum, Salvio Hexia, and other high-level protections he couldn't name. The atmosphere around the school was tenser. Regulus knew the Ministry of Magic well enough. Ineffectual, compromising, weak. The hardliners were worn down by bickering and retreat. Dumbledore, frustrated, had begun finding his own ways to fortify the school. The Order of the Phoenix seemed likely to form around this time. Still, Regulus doubted that Dumbledore's measures could stop Voldemort's expansion entirely. War was inevitable and fierce. Dumbledore could protect Hogwarts and its students, could hold this bastion, but not the whole wizarding world. That was Dumbledore's burden, not his. Regulus had to focus on himself and the House of Black. The carriage passed through the gates and stopped at the castle. Regulus was among the first to disembark and followed the stream of students into the Great Hall. Candles drifted overhead and the enchanted ceiling reflected the night sky. The long tables were full. The younger students whispered excitedly about their holidays, while older students' expressions ranged from solemn to eager to indifferent. Muggleborns looked uneasy, purebloods clustered together, and half-bloods watched both sides. After the sorting, Dumbledore stood and the hall quieted. "Welcome back," he said, his voice clear and resonant. "Another year begins. I know that for many the past year was far from peaceful, and the coming year may not be much different." His gaze swept the tables and paused briefly over Slytherin. "Still, I hope you will find time here for learning, growth, and friendship. These are what you should be focused on now." Regulus listened, but his thoughts drifted. Dumbledore was the most powerful wizard in the world and could have exerted influence far more forcefully. Hogwarts produced most of the wizarding world's leaders. With Dumbledore's power, he could shape the minds of those who left the school. He could use subtle mental persuasion, soul-touching magic, or more overt guidance. Yet he did not. Was it that he would not, or that he chose not to? Probably the latter. Doing so would provoke the pureblood families, who would resist any hint of brainwashing. Even so, Hogwarts did little by way of deliberate ideological education. They spoke of justice, kindness, and choosing rightly, but not in a systematic way that guided students from childhood on. That was why Hogwarts's voice never truly dominated the wizarding world. Dumbledore's words were only his own. The school's teachings were not a unified, influential force. Regulus pushed the thought away. He was not the principal. It was pointless to stew over it. Dumbledore continued. "There is also an adjustment to this year's Defense Against the Dark Arts curriculum. From third year up, students will be taught practical defensive spells. The Shield Charm, the Disarming Charm, and the Impediment Jinx, with extra practice time added to the timetable." A low murmur rippled through the hall. Regulus knew what this meant. Dumbledore was preparing students to defend themselves. It was the first curricular change prompted by the growing threat. The new defense professor rose and nodded to the students. Gryffindor cheered, Hufflepuff responded politely, Ravenclaw appraised the new teacher. On the Slytherin side, responses were subtler. Some blank faces, some faint sneers, some eyes that flickered with interest. They understood the implication. These spells were taught with them in mind. The feast ended, and the Slytherins headed for the common room. Back in the dormitory, Avery collapsed onto his bed with a relieved sigh. Alex sat at the edge of his, uneasy. "What the headmaster said," he began. "What about it?" Avery asked. "The new courses," Alex went on. "The shield charm and all that." He didn't finish, but the question was clear. Is war really coming? Regulus watched him. After a holiday with his family, Alex had softened. A gentle, pure-blood upbringing didn't make for hardiness. His home had been warm and his parents kind, and he was reluctant to face the upheaval outside. Still, compared to the beginning of school, Alex had improved. He could at least sit and think instead of shrinking away. Avery showed little change, concerned, but not overly so. Young pureblood masters like him had not been schooled in politics or the wider situation. They were often more naive than children from peripheral pureblood or half-blood families. Hermes, by contrast, seemed indifferent. He leaned against the headboard with his eyes closed as if resting, and Regulus sensed he might even welcome disorder. Chaos offered opportunity. In chaos, power could be seized, and his practical experience would speak loudest. Regulus said nothing and lay down. Outside the window, the black lake glowed a faint green, its light reflected on the ceiling above. First day of term, first class, potions, down on the first-floor dungeon. The Slytherins and Gryffindors sat apart, separated by several rows of empty desks like an invisible wall. The Gryffindor side buzzed with chatter as students traded holiday stories. The Slytherin side was far quieter. Low conversations were quickly shushed, and most pupils sat waiting for the professor to arrive. Regulus and Hermes were in a small group near the wall, with Avery and Alex behind them. The classroom back door opened, and Professor Slughorn squeezed through, his rotund belly first, his smiling face following. He went to the podium, spread his arms as if to embrace the whole room, and spoke with theatrical enthusiasm. "Ah, second years, welcome back. How were your holidays? I hope you all had a good rest, because this year—" He blinked, lowering his voice for effect. "We shall be coming into contact with some rather interesting things." With a flourish of his wand, the chalk on the blackboard began to write by itself. Healing potion, ingredients, Dittany leaf juice, Ashwinder eggshell powder, daisy roots, dragon blood. Properties, rapidly heals moderate wounds, causes a distinct burning sensation. Difficulty, extremely sensitive to ingredient order, requires high heat. Slughorn clapped and produced a crystal vial from beneath the podium. He held it up to the light. Inside, a pale red liquid glowed, clear as diluted ruby juice. Healing potion. Last year you learned basic remedies for scrapes. This, he shook the vial, can close a 3-inch deep wound in seconds. It will be hot, though, like being scorched by fire, which is why it's called a healing potion. He set the vial back down and explained the ingredients. Dittany leaf juice is the core of the healing effect. Freshness determines potency. The samples on your tables were collected last night, but his eyes swept the room with a small smile. If someone could extract it on the spot, it would be even stronger. Still, since you're only second years, we will follow the steps. Ashwinder eggshell powder provides the burning sensation and acts as a stabilizer. Daisy roots neutralize excessive heat to prevent burns. A trace of dragon blood catalyzes healing speed, but add 1 drop too many and the whole pot must be discarded. He seemed to savor the podium. "Right," he clapped. "Let's begin. Follow this order. Start with the Dittany leaf juice and heat it over medium until bubbles form at the edges. Add the sliced daisy roots and stir clockwise 7 times. Wait for the brew to turn pale cyan, then add the Ashwinder eggshell powder in 3 batches, 30 seconds apart. Finally, turn off the heat. When it cools to warm, add the dragon blood, 1 drop only." Mortars ground and cauldrons hissed across the room, punctuated by the occasional gasp when someone knocked something over. Regulus, however, was in no hurry. He listened to Slughorn's instructions, but his attention was already elsewhere. This lesson was far too basic for him. His natural magic let him perceive the magical state of plants directly. The steps and cautions being taught were, to him, like instructing someone how to use a spoon, useful but unnecessary. Silently, he extended his magical perception. 4 sets of ingredients sat on the desk in different containers. The Dittany leaf juice was a green liquid with an active magical aura, like leaves freshly picked and still breathing. Its edges, however, had dissipated somewhat after a few hours, losing a little vitality. The Ashwinder eggshell powder was grayish-white with a steady magical signature, a dead stability, like solidified flames that no longer burned, only residual warmth. The sliced daisy roots were pale yellow with a gentle, lingering aura, like a small current moving slowly. The single drop of dragon blood, sealed in a tiny crystal vial, was bright red, its magical presence so violent it seemed to batter against the glass. Living energy, still boiling. Regulus thought if he brewed this potion, he needn't follow the prescribed sequence. By using magical perception to monitor the potion's state in real time, Judging what to add and when to stir according to the ebb and flow of magic, he could be far more precise than any fixed procedure. He considered the essence of potion making. The steps, sequences, and techniques taught by predecessors were merely paths. They led to the destination if followed. But a path was not the only way. If one could perceive the destination directly, why follow the path at all? He looked at Slughorn's finished vial on the podium. The pale red liquid swayed, its magical aura stable and gently healing. Slughorn stepped down to inspect students' progress. When he reached Regulus's row, Regulus glanced up and whispered, "Professor, may I see that finished vial?" Slughorn peered down with a flicker of curiosity. "Oh, Mr. Black, is there a problem?" "Just want to confirm the state of the finished product," Regulus said. Slughorn regarded him for a moment, then laughed softly. He picked up the healing potion from the podium, walked back, and placed it on Regulus's desk. "Have a look then," he said, "but don't take too long. Others will want to use it as a reference." Regulus held the crystal vial in his palm, closed his eyes, and pushed his magical perception into it. The potion unfolded in his mind. The pale red color became a spectrum of magical auras. The healing tendency from the dittany sat at the base, thick, lingering, like soil over a seed. The ashwinder's burning hugged it like a thin ring of flame, hot but not consuming. The daisy root's neutralizing aura flowed between the two layers, keeping the heat in check. The drop of dragon blood acted as catalyst, threading through the auras, enlivening them and causing them to entwine into a stable whole. He perceived the exact magical state the finished potion should have, a healing inclination balanced with a controlled burn, all components fused properly. He set the vial down, nodded politely to Slughorn, and said, "Thank you, Professor." Slughorn glanced at him and moved on without comment. Regulus turned back to his table. With magical perception and magical control fully engaged, he began to gather and refine the ingredient's auras. He concentrated the scattered healing aura of the dittany, solidifying it from an erratic state into something stable. He reignited the dormant heat in the ashwinder powder, and then immediately suppressed it, like taming a flame to provide only warmth, not spread. The daisy root's gentle current quickened into a ready, neutralizing flow. He restrained the violent catalytic pulse of the dragon blood, holding it in check until the right moment. The four magical currents coexisted and shifted under his guidance, independent yet drawing at one another. He allowed them to attract and align until they generated their own tendency to fuse. He felt the moment arrive. Regulus opened his eyes and began adding the ingredients to his cauldron in an order Slughorn had never taught. He poured the dittany leaf juice first, the green liquid spreading across the bottom. He added the ashwinder eggshell powder next. The grayish dust fell into the green with no heating and no stirring. Then the sliced daisy roots, pale yellow, landed on top. Finally, he dripped the dragon blood into the center. Hermes, working on his own ingredients nearby, glanced over and saw that Regulus had ignored the instructions. He hadn't heated anything. Instead, the ingredients in the cauldron began to move on their own. They fused. Within a dozen seconds, the motion ceased. The result in Regulus's pot was a pale red liquid, clear and stable, exactly like the vial on the podium. Hermes looked away and resumed his task. He didn't speak. He had long since accepted that Regulus operated on a different level. That was true in combat, true in the dark arts, and now true in potions as well. To stare longer would only make him question his own life choices. Slughorn, standing in a corner, had watched the entire process. He had seen Regulus hover his hand in perception, the order in which he added the ingredients, and the way they fused without external heat. He recognized the method, an ancient preparation technique. Before potions became a systematic field, powerful potioneers would brew this way, not by following rigid steps or heating, but by using magical guidance to draw the ingredients' auras together so they fused naturally. The method had been abandoned because it was exquisitely difficult. Only a few legendary brewers in history had ever achieved it reliably, and it worked mainly for lower-level potions. For advanced mixtures that required a potioneer's aura throughout the process or complex formulas tied to ritual timing, the old way was useless. Still, this was something a second-year student should not be capable of. Slughorn made no scene. He noted what he'd seen, then moved on to inspect other students. The bell rang, and pupils began handing their vials to the podium. Slughorn looked at each one in turn, commenting, grading, occasionally granting extra marks. Regulus sealed his potion in a small vial, handed it in, and said nothing. He knew what he had done was a shortcut. He had not followed the method the professor had taught, which by the book could be called cheating. He didn't want attention. Slughorn gave him a grade without comment. Just as Regulus rose to leave, Slughorn's voice called from behind. "Mr. Black, stay a moment." Regulus stopped and turned back toward the podium. The classroom was empty except for Slughorn, still seated behind the desk, holding Regulus's bottle of healing potion up to the light. The pale red liquid swayed gently in the glass. "Perfect," Slughorn said admiringly. "In terms of magical purity and stability, this is even better than my own." He set the bottle down and looked at Regulus. "The method you used, letting the essences of the ingredients fuse on their own, is indeed effective for low-level potions like the healing potion." "People used to do this," he went on. Regulus wasn't surprised. It would have been odd if the potions master hadn't seen through it. Slughorn was one of the few in the wizarding world who truly understood potions. Regulus also knew the limits of the technique. It worked for simple potions, but higher-level concoctions required more than letting essences mingle. Timing, ritual, and even the brewer's own essence or emotional involvement could be necessary. Those were advanced matters, rarely taught and rarely encountered. There was no need to explain all that now, so he waited quietly, a little more respectful than before. Slughorn's gaze drifted out the window, as if remembering something far away. Hundreds of years ago, before potions took the form we use today, some wizards worked that way. There were no standard procedures, no fixed recipes, just direct perception of the materials and instinctive control. They'd pick up an herb, smell it, touch it, and know what it should be paired with and how it should be handled. The things they produced often outperformed our modern brews. He turned back to Regulus. "Do you know why that method disappeared and we moved to the step-by-step system we have now? Because it was too difficult?" Regulus guessed. "Extremely difficult." Slughorn nodded. "Not something talent alone can accomplish. That way of working needs more than intelligence or diligence. It requires a perception in communion with the materials, almost instinctive. You must be able to hear what the ingredients' essences are saying, see what they want to become, process the changes of dozens of magical currents in your mind at once, and react in a heartbeat. The smallest slip and the materials are ruined." He shook his head. "Wizards who reach that level can be counted on one hand. That's why the potions masters of old became legends. The modern system made potions reproducible and teachable. Mediocre talent can produce acceptable potions, and geniuses don't waste ingredients because of a momentary oversight. That is progress." His eyes on Regulus grew more serious. "But you did it." Regulus kept silent and let Slughorn continue. The professor paused, then asked, "Regulus, what do you think a potion is?" Regulus opened his mouth to answer, but Slughorn raised a hand. "No rush. Let me speak first." He stood, walked to the window, and turned his back to Regulus. "Most people think a potion is just throwing ingredients into a cauldron in order, steeping them long enough, and it's done. They're wrong. A potion is not merely an accumulation of materials, nor is it just the sum of magical reactions. The essence of a potion lies in allowing the essences of different materials, under precise conditions, to accept and fuse with one another until they form a wholly new magical entity. That entity has its own life, its own tendencies, its own will. A successful potion is like a newborn. It has temperament, personality, purpose." He walked back to the table, held the bottle up to the light, and examined it closely. "Take this healing potion. Its healing inclination is the product of the dittany and other ingredients fused together. Dittany alone will only staunch bleeding. Other components alone might rage uncontrollably. But when they fuse into a healing potion, something new is born, something with the will to heal." He set the bottle down and met Regulus's eyes. "What you did just now was perceive those essences and guide them to accept and fuse with each other. You weren't making a healing potion so much as letting those materials become a healing potion. Those are two very different things." Regulus said nothing. Slughorn was right. The professor went on. Being able to reach that step shows your perception and understanding of essence exceed that of most adult wizards. It's talent and ability, but I must warn you of one thing. His face grew serious. Magic is alive. The essences of materials are alive, and so is the essence of the finished potion. When you guide them to fuse, you're dealing with living things. They have inclinations, and you have made them become what you wanted. But the process affects you too. He leaned forward. Do this long enough, and you will grow used to shaping essences to your will. That's not inherently bad. But remember, essence is not a servant, it is a partner. You can guide it, but you cannot enslave it. If you try to dominate it completely, it will rebel one day. Something stirred in Regulus. The words echoed a vague memory of what the entity in the sleeping sea abyss had said about invitation and control. He nodded sincerely. I understand, Professor. Thank you for the guidance. Slughorn studied him for a moment, then laughed with a pleased, almost emotional sound. Good, as long as you understand. He eased back into his chair. From now on, in my classes you may brew as you like, but don't be too showy. Other students get discouraged when they see something beyond them. I'll remember that, Regulus said. Your words have been of great help. He bowed slightly, said his farewells, and left. Outside the potions classroom, Avery and the others were waiting. Regulus nodded and continued on. They followed. Avery and Alex didn't think much of it. Regulus being kept behind by a professor was standard procedure. They exchanged a glance, shrugged, and paid it no mind. Hermes lagged a half-step behind, watching Regulus from the corner of his eye. He'd been thinking about the scene in class and guessed that whatever had happened had a lot to do with why Slughorn kept Regulus afterwards. But since Regulus hadn't offered any information, Hermes pretended nothing had happened. He thought back to his own holiday at the family estate, 2 months of training, his father personally sparring with him and teaching dangerous, practical things, the variant applications of the dark arts, rapid spell switching in combat, concealing intent while casting. One outing with his father had opened his eyes. He felt he'd advanced a level in both power and perspective. But the simplicity of what Regulus had done, laying a hand on the ingredients and letting the potion form as if by an invisible hand, made Hermes realize the gap between them hadn't narrowed at all. If anything, it had widened. He couldn't fathom that method. Regulus reflected on Slughorn's words as they walked. Summed up, the advice was simple. Don't fight the essences. Treat them as partners. Essences have life. It sounded like the kind of philosophical rambling old professors indulged in. Befriend the essence. Listen to its voice. Yet it reminded him of what Dumbledore had said in the headmaster's office. Converse with the essences. Dumbledore and Slughorn were undoubtedly the foremost authorities in their fields. Dumbledore was acknowledged as the greatest wizard of the age, and Slughorn, while perhaps not as powerful, was the most professional in potions. Their views on magical essence and energy were strikingly similar. Regulus considered his own relationship with essence. It wasn't confrontation or dialogue, it was simply utility. He used essence like a tool. Whatever effect he needed, he summoned it. Magic was an extension of his will, obedient and effective. But both Dumbledore and Slughorn insisted that wasn't enough. One needed to communicate, to make essence a partner. Regulus knew they were right. If such masters advocated it, they had likely succeeded. But was that the only right path? He thought of Voldemort's Dark Enlightenment, which argued for a different approach. Domination, total control, forcing essence into submission. Voldemort had taken that road and reached the pinnacle as well. Regulus shook his head slightly. This was probably a question for later, more a matter of magical philosophy, a basic attitude toward essence that would shape a lifetime. A worldview doesn't change what you eat today, but it determines how you will eat for the rest of your life. Professors bringing this to his attention showed they believed he needed to know. Ordinary wizards might never encounter such teaching. They'd never reach a point where it mattered. If you told them essence had life and should be treated as a friend, they'd call you foolish. But the professors treated Regulus as if he would reach that height someday. That was recognition and expectation. By the time he reached the dormitory door, he had pushed the thoughts aside. Avery and the others followed him in. Avery leaned close, curious. Regulus, what did the professor say? You've been thinking the whole way back. Alex and Hermes looked over as well. Regulus paused, then shook his head with a faint, indescribable sigh. Slughorn is a good professor. Chapter 197. Where's your pure-blood young master's pride? Wednesday morning. The Scottish Highlands were enjoying a rare spell of fine weather. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows of Hogwarts, casting patches of light across the stone floors of the corridors. History of Magic, shared with Hufflepuff. Professor Binns drifted into the classroom in his usual fashion, emerging through the blackboard and settling behind the lectern. He opened his unchanging lesson plan and began to lecture in that monotonous voice that could put the living to sleep and wake the dead. Today's topic is the Giant Wars. Occurring in the late 19th century, it is a collective term for a series of long-term conflicts between wizards and giants. Giants are massive in size, possess formidable strength, and have a natural resistance to magic. They frequently attacked wizarding settlements, threatening the enforcement of the International Statute of Wizarding Secrecy. Most of the students in the classroom were doing their own thing. Some were surreptitiously flipping through illustrated spellbooks under their notes. Some were chatting in low voices, and several were sprawled out and asleep. Professor Binns never cared about such things. He only needed to finish his lecture. Whether anyone was listening was not his concern. The Ministry of Magic eventually formed Auror units, employing a combination of expulsion and encirclement to force the giants back to the most remote mountainous regions of Europe. Regulus listened with only half an ear, his mind wandering. Giants, as a species, seemed designed to fill the tank role in the world's bestiary. Immense physical power, strong resistance to magic, and hard to kill. Ordinary spells were like tickles to them. If put in game terms, they were natural-born tanks, huge health, high defenses, no special gear or skills required. Just standing there, they could hold a line. Intriguingly, they were not reproductively isolated from wizards. Biologically, this suggested that giants and wizards were different branches of the same species, like golden retrievers and toy poodles are both dogs. The wizarding world even had famous mixed bloods, like Rubeus Hagrid. He suppressed the thought as slightly impolite. After all, Professor Flitwick was of mixed heritage as well, and deserved respect. Regulus let his thoughts drift on anyway. Magic bloodline families, it seemed, could produce half-breeds with various intelligent humanoids. Half-giants, goblin bloods, and other mixes. Were there half-centaurs? He'd never heard of any. Centaurs were centaurs. Merfolk, there were merpeople, but not half-merpeople in common knowledge. He was thinking too far afield and brought himself back to the giants. It made sense that giants would be recruited by both the Order of the Phoenix and the Death Eaters. Natural top-tier combatants were valuable. Regulus assumed many of them would end up siding with Voldemort. Hatred and promises of power made for powerful incentives. Yet the giants had been reduced from hundreds of tribes to just a few dozen individuals hiding in Europe's remotest mountains. That decline suggested their real gold content wasn't that high. Wizards had taken heavy losses in the conflicts, but in the end, the giants were nearly driven to extinction. No matter how physically mighty a non-human race was, they couldn't hold out against an organized wizarding force. Nor was it actually impossible for a skilled wizard to deal with a giant. Voldemort's reason for recruiting giants, Regulus suspected, was less about battlefield supremacy and more about using them to massacre muggles and whip up terror. He pulled his thoughts back as Professor Binns droned on, his voice like wind through dry leaves. Thereafter, the Ministry classified giants as extremely dangerous creatures and strictly forbade wizards from contacting them. The bell rang, and Professor Binns's lecturing stopped abruptly. He drifted up from behind the lectern, passed through the blackboard, and vanished. In the afternoon came Charms with Professor Flitwick. Regulus followed the crowd into the Charms classroom and took a seat near the bookshelves. Flitwick was already perched on his stack of books, high-pitched and enthusiastic as always. Today, we will learn the locking spell. With a flick of his wand, the classroom door slammed shut. Colloportus! An unseen force sealed the lock. A few Ravenclaws tugged at the door and failed. Flitwick beamed at them. The locking spell is a simple charm, but very useful. When you cast it, you must intend to lock the door firmly, concentrating your magical power on the lock. Now, everyone, try. Incantations rose and fell across the room. Some locks clicked obediently, others stubbornly resisted. Some students overchanneled, and the door vibrated with a hum. Regulus casually spoke the charm, and the lock clicked in response. For him, it was trivial. A single thought was enough, but he still practiced a few times as an exercise for his wrist. After class, Regulus went to the library. Madame Pince sat at the entrance, her hooked nose turned toward every entrant. Regulus nodded and stepped inside, heading for his usual spot by the window in the corner. He took out the Essence of Magic and Principles of Spellcasting and turned to the page he'd left off. He read for a while before footsteps approached. He looked up. Lily was standing across the table, a few books cradled in her arms, her expression oddly solemn. Regulus acknowledged her with a nod. "Lily?" She returned a small, formal nod and sat down. Regulus watched her gently. He could tell she was still irritated, but it wasn't true anger. It was theatrical, like a child saying, "I'm upset, comfort me." Then he realized she was still only 13. Regulus closed his book. He moved his hand slightly under the table, and a silence charm bloomed, quietly swallowing the two of them in a bubble of privacy. "I was wrong," he said, genuinely. Lily's deliberately stern face began to falter. She looked annoyed, but also a little amused. Who apologizes straight away? Where was his pure-blood young master's reserve? "The holidays were too busy," Regulus said softly. "It wasn't that I forgot. I really couldn't find the time." He didn't say what had kept him busy. He didn't mention Germany, who he'd met, or what had happened. The tone, though, was sincere enough to make it impossible for Lily to keep a straight face. She stared at him for a moment. The corners of her mouth wanted to turn up, but she fought it. "You're like this every time," she said, voice still stiff, though her expression had softened. Regulus considered and protested mildly. "I'm not like this every time." "Then did you write to me before?" Lily pressed, eyes wide. "No," Regulus blinked innocently. "So you are like this every time," Lily declared with the certainty of a child closing a case. The logic was flawed, but Regulus didn't argue. He kept smiling gently at her. Lily felt a little shy under his gaze and looked away, flipping through the book on the table. "I wasn't really angry," she muttered. "I know heirs of families like yours must be busy over the holidays. I'm not like that. Once I'm done with homework, I can play." She sounded as if she were making excuses for him. "You must have had important business." Regulus said nothing. He simply kept that patient expression. Lily flipped a few pages and then looked up again. "But could you at least tell me next time? Even just one sentence. I'm busy, can't write, so I would know." Regulus nodded. "All right." She blinked, and the corners of her mouth finally creased into a smile. "Fine, I'll let you off." Regulus smiled in return. The silence charm still held them. The library around them was quiet, apart from the occasional turning of pages and distant footsteps. Lily resumed reading, while Regulus returned to his own book. The light outside dimmed as dinner time approached. Lily closed her book and looked up. Her expression was more serious now. "Regulus, I want to ask you something." He nodded. "Hmm?" She hesitated. "How do you view the dark arts?" She went on, voice small. "I had a fight with Severus because he's learning some things. He says it's not the dark arts, just deeper magic," Lily added. "But those books, those spells, they look terrifying." She looked at Regulus with confusion and a little hope. "How do people in Slytherin see the dark arts? Is it true that everyone is learning them?" Regulus was quiet a moment, then asked, "Do you want the truth or do you want reassurance?" Lily fixed him with a glare. "The truth," he obliged. "Not all Slytherins are learning the dark arts. Most attend classes like anyone else, study for exams, and graduate normally. The dark arts aren't easy to master, and not everyone dares to touch them." "But the dark arts themselves aren't necessarily what you think," he continued. "What do you think the dark arts are?" Lily thought. "Magic that hurts people, spells that cause pain or death. That's one form of the dark arts." "Yes," Regulus said. "But the definition is blurry. Some spells are clearly dark, like the unforgivable curses, but others aren't so obvious." He gave an example. "Take Fiendfire." Lily frowned. "Fiendfire? Isn't that dark arts?" He agreed. "But it was originally created to deal with extremely dangerous dark creatures, to destroy near indestructible dark artifacts, to defend against large-scale incursions, and to build impenetrable walls of flame. It was later abused, often by wizards who misused it or lacked skill. Lily was quiet for a long moment. "Have you ever used the dark arts?" she asked softly. Regulus met her gaze, calm. "I have." Her face didn't change, as if she'd expected that. "Do you think people who use the dark arts become evil?" He answered directly. "Some will." Lily's eyes widened. "So he cut in. "Some people are controlled by the dark arts. Some people control the dark arts." That was all he said, but Lily heard the implication. He was not one of those controlled by it. She believed him, without any particular reason beyond the quiet assurance in his voice. "As for Severus," Regulus added, "I don't know which of those he is. You'd have to ask him." Lily lowered her head and stared at the book on the table. "He wasn't like this before," she said softly. "He used to just love magic, researching strange things. We would read together and discuss together." She trailed off. Regulus said nothing. Some questions had to be answered in time. After a long pause, she looked up. "Thank you, Regulus." She looked more at ease. "I should go to dinner." He dispelled the silence charm with a nod. Lily stood, tucked her books under her arm, and took a few steps. She turned back once. "Write to me next time." Regulus gave a small smile. "All right." Lily shot him a look and then left for dinner. Chapter 198, The Metaphysics of Transfiguration. Friday of the first week of term, thick clouds muffled the light outside the Transfiguration classroom on the second floor of Hogwarts Castle. It looked like rain might fall at any moment. The desks and chairs were arranged neatly, a box of matches placed on each desk. Slytherin students sat on the left, Ravenclaw on the right. The two houses were visibly divided, but not as hostile to one another as they were to Gryffindor. The Ravenclaws were mostly absorbed in their own concerns and had little interest in school politics. Professor McGonagall stood behind the podium, posture straight, hair pulled into her habitual bun, spectacles catching the dim light. Once the room had fallen quiet, she began. Second-year transfiguration will progress from basic changes to transformations of material essence. In your first year, you learn to turn an inanimate object into another inanimate object, turning a match into a needle. That was the entry level of transfiguration. This semester, you will learn untransfiguration. Today's task is to turn the match on your desk into a needle, and then turn that needle back into a match. With a flick of her wand, the blackboard filled with the lesson title and 3 theoretical points: reversibility and preservation of essence in morphological transfiguration. Any transformation must preserve the target's essence. A match transfigured into a needle must actually be able to sew. Transfiguration is a material change, not an illusion. Reversibility is the test of whether a transformation is true. If it cannot be restored, you have not truly transformed the object. The caster must understand what the essential nature of the target object is. The operational steps were spelled out as well. First, turn the match into a needle. Review. Second, turn the needle back into a match. New material for today. Third, compare the returned match with the original. "Begin," Professor McGonagall said. Incantations rose and fell through the room. Veriverto! Veriverto! Turning a match into a needle was routine. They'd practiced it all year. Turning a needle back into a match was far harder. For most of the younger students, the needles they produced only looked like needles, point and eye, but the core remained matchwood. Many simply didn't know what they'd made. Magic could shape a match into a needle-like object, but whether that object was metal or wood, solid or hollow, capable of sewing or only of pricking, if you didn't know what you'd created, how could you change it back? Problems began to appear. Some returned matches were too thick, some too thin, some cracked at the slightest touch. McGonagall walked between the desks, stopping to offer correction. "Miss Ellis, can the needle you made sew?" "Try, no, it doesn't pierce the fabric. It only looks like a needle." "Mr. Block, why is the match you turned back curved?" "Because the needle you formed was curved to begin with." Regulus picked up the match on the table. Oak, about 3 inches long, smooth, with a dark sulfur head. He tapped it lightly with his wand. Veriverto. The match became a needle, silver white, straight-shanked, keen point, rounded eye. He tested it on a piece of coarse cloth. The needle moved on its own, slid through the fabric, and stitched 2 neat stitches. Regulus palmed the needle, tapped it again. It returned to being a match, identical in color, length, thickness to the original, without the slightest difference. He set it down, unhurried. He had been doing untransfiguration since early childhood. When he was 3, Sirius had turned a silver spoon into an earthworm. Regulus had turned the earthworm back into the spoon. He was 12 now. Professor McGonagall happened to pass by his desk, picked up the returned match, held it to the light, then replaced it. "Very good, Mr. Black." Her tone was neutral, praise without emphasis. For Regulus, being able to do this was expected. She addressed the class as she continued her patrol. "Do you see? This is standard reversible transformation. What changes is not only shape, but also the object's essence." She paused. "Of course, that's the standard. Being able to achieve it is another matter. Continue practicing." Regulus looked at the match, then at the words on the blackboard. Transformation must preserve the target's essence. He wondered, what was the essence of the match? The wood? The shape? Its ability to burn? He picked it up again and let his magical perception probe the object. The internal structure opened before his awareness. Wood fibers, the sulfur residue in the head, and the faint magical trace left by his earlier transfiguration. The grain and density peculiar to oak were conspicuous. What if the essence was not fixed? He began to construct in his mind a different match. Limewood instead of oak, lighter in color, softer, with a sparser grain, and a different sulfur composition at the head. He tapped his wand once more. Vera Verto. The match became a needle, exactly the same as before. He tapped again, and the needle reverted to a match. But this time the returned match was not the original oak, it was limewood. Lighter in color, softer to the touch, it felt different in his hand. Regulus examined it and put it down, a question forming in his mind. If transfiguration could change the material essence, oak into lime, then what was truly unchangeable? Was essence the wrong word? There seemed to be no single immutable essence, only countless attributes that could be altered. If so, what made the object still the same object? If not the same, where had the original gone? Professor McGonagall had not gone far. She had watched him. This lesson was simple for him. She knew he would experiment. Sure enough, after Regulus finished the first transformation, he had stared at the match, performed an extra transformation, and studied the returned match with a thoughtful expression. She walked over, glanced at the match, then at him. There was a subtle look in her eyes, one that said, "I know what you tried." She set the match on the desk, said nothing, only nodded, and resumed her patrol. When the bell rang, she continued circulating while the students handed in their work and left. Just as Regulus was about to go, her voice called from behind him. "Mr. Black, come to my office." He stopped and nodded. "Yes, Professor." Inside her office, she motioned him to sit. She did not waste time. "In class just now, you altered the essence of the match." Regulus inclined his head in modest acknowledgement. He wasn't sure his change matched the professor's meaning, but he would listen. "Oak into lime," she continued. "If you can achieve a permanent transformation like that, then what you are doing is conversion, not mere change. Do you know the difference?" He thought for a moment. "Transfiguration changes matter, while conversion changes essence?" "Close," she said, "but not precisely. Transfiguration modifies along the original basis. Conversion is a complete replacement, but the prerequisite is permanence." He hesitated, then asked, "Professor, then what is unchangeable?" McGonagall looked at him steadily. "What you're asking is whether there is anything that even conversion cannot alter." He nodded. "There is," she said. She tapped her wand lightly. The match on the desk rose and hovered. "The reason this thing is a match is not just because it's wood. It also has a place in the world. It was manufactured in a particular factory, sold at a particular shop, picked up by you at a particular moment, and at some time in the future it will be struck and lit." The match dropped back onto the desk. Those positions, those relationships, those points on the timeline, transfiguration cannot change them. Regulus felt his thoughts tilt. What she said was simple to understand, but its implications were deep. He fumbled. "Are you talking about fate?" McGonagall shook her head. "Not exactly. Fate is passive, something arranged for you. I'm talking about position, the connection to everything else in the great web of the world. A match can become limewood, but where it sits in the box, the moment you picked it up, the future instant it is ignited, Those remain. You changed its material, not its place in the weave. Regulus considered positions, relationships, temporal coordinates, connections with other things, the object's destined future. These were things Transfiguration could not touch, at least not by him, and not that he could imagine anyone changing. Merlin? Then what if, he ventured slowly, even those could be changed? McGonagall's gaze deepened, threaded with something like longing. Then that would not be Transfiguration. What would it be? He asked. Creation, she said, or rather, redefinition. The office fell silent. Regulus held her words close. After a while, her expression softened. How are you progressing with that notebook? He blinked, returned to the present, and bowed slightly. I'm studying it. I need more time to understand. Demonstrate it, she said. He stood and drew his wand. He concentrated, and magic gathered above the desk. A small patch of space, about the size of a palm, grew blurred and warped. A primitive, barely formed distortion, weak and unshaped, but undeniably a change in space itself. Spatial transfiguration. McGonagall watched, her face composed, a small glint of satisfaction at the corners of her eyes. It's still a long way off, she said seriously, but the direction is right. Regulus let his wand fall, and the distortion subsided. Continue practicing, she added. If you have questions, come to me. I will, Professor, Regulus replied gratefully. Mr. Black, she said as he rose to leave, the question you asked, whether anything is unchangeable, is an important one. Keep thinking about it. At the end of the path of transfiguration, you will meet it. The earlier you begin, the further you will go. Regulus bowed and left the office with those words echoing in his mind.